In the vast fields of southern Poland, beyond the brick buildings and rail tracks of Auschwitz, stood a place that became one of the most haunting landscapes of the Holocaust: Birkenau. Here, the Nazi regime constructed a system designed for mass killing on an industrial scale. Gas chambers and crematoria were built to carry out extermination with chilling efficiency. For a time, these facilities were intended to conceal the evidence of what was happening behind the barbed wire and guard towers. But there were moments during the war when even this machinery of death could not keep pace with the scale of the crime. During the peak months of deportations in 1944, especially when trains arrived carrying thousands of Hungarian Jews, the number of victims overwhelmed the capacity of the crematoria. The systems designed to destroy evidence began to fail under the sheer weight of the atrocity. It was in those moments that the SS turned to one of the most horrific methods used in the camp: open-air burning pits. These pits, dug into the ground near the crematoria, became grim extensions of the killing process when the ovens could no longer handle the numbers. Prisoners forced into the Sonderkommando units were compelled to carry out this terrible work. Under constant guard and threat of death, they were made to transport bodies and feed the fires that burned day and night. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. Birkenau, the camp built for extermination. In the early years of the Second World War, the landscape around the small Polish village of Brzezinka began to change in ways that no one living there could have imagined only a few years earlier. The region had long been quiet farmland, a place of scattered houses, narrow roads, and fields stretching out toward the horizon. But after the German occupation of Poland in 1939, the Nazi authorities began transforming this quiet rural area into something entirely different. What would eventually become known as Auschwitz-Birkenau slowly emerged as one of the largest and most infamous concentration and extermination complexes built by Nazi Germany. The development of Birkenau did not happen overnight. It unfolded step by step as Nazi officials expanded their plans for imprisonment, forced labor, and ultimately mass murder. At first, the nearby camp of Auschwitz I served as the primary center of operations in the region. Established in former Polish army barracks, Auschwitz I initially functioned as a concentration camp for political prisoners and other individuals targeted by the Nazi regime. Yet, as the war expanded across Europe, the number of people the Nazis sought to imprison and control grew rapidly. By 1941, German authorities began searching for ways to expand the camp system beyond the limited space available at Auschwitz I. It was during this period that the decision was made to construct a massive new camp several kilometers away, in the open fields surrounding Brzezinka. This new camp would later be known as Auschwitz II-Birkenau. Construction began under harsh conditions. Prisoners forced to work on the site cleared land, drained marshy ground, and laid the foundations for what would eventually become a sprawling complex of barracks, guard towers, and fences. The scale of the project was enormous. Plans envisioned a camp capable of holding tens of thousands of prisoners, far larger than any of the earlier facilities in the Auschwitz system. Long rows of wooden and brick barracks were erected across the muddy terrain, separated by wide gravel roads and enclosed by electrified barbed wire fences. Guard towers stood at regular intervals along the perimeter, giving SS guards a clear view of every corner of the camp. From the beginning, Birkenau was designed with strict control in mind. The layout of the camp allowed guards to monitor prisoners constantly while also maintaining a rigid separation between different sections. Men, women, and various groups of prisoners were housed in different compounds, each surrounded by its own fences and gates. Movement within the camp was tightly regulated, and prisoners were required to follow strict routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and inspections. Yet even as the physical structures of Birkenau were still under construction, the camp's purpose began evolving in ways that would eventually define its place in history. By 1942, the Nazi regime had begun implementing what it called the final solution, a systematic plan aimed at murdering millions of Jews across occupied Europe. As this policy unfolded, Birkenau became central to the machinery of that plan. The camp's remote location, its rail connections, and its vast capacity made it an ideal site for carrying out the mass deportations and killings that followed. Trains began arriving from across Europe, carrying thousands of deportees packed into freight wagons after long journeys under brutal conditions. Many of those transported to Birkenau had little understanding of where they were being taken or what awaited them at the end of the journey. The arrival of these transports marked the beginning of a process that would soon define the camp's grim reputation. As Birkenau expanded during 1942 and 1943, its infrastructure was increasingly adapted to serve the goals of mass extermination. Early experiments with killing methods had already taken place at Auschwitz I, where a former morgue had been converted into a gas chamber using the pesticide Zyklon B. The Nazis soon decided that larger facilities were needed to handle the growing number of deportations arriving at Birkenau. Plans were drawn up to construct 4 large crematoria complexes within the camp, each equipped with gas chambers and multiple ovens designed to dispose of bodies. These buildings, later known as Crematoria II, III, IV, and V, were built between 1943 and 1944. Their design reflected a chilling attempt to combine efficiency with concealment. Underground gas chambers were constructed so that victims could be led inside under the false impression that they were entering shower facilities. After the killing process, the bodies were transported to nearby cremation ovens where they were burned. The entire system was intended to operate continuously, processing large numbers of victims in a short amount of time. For the Nazi leadership overseeing Auschwitz, these facilities represented the industrialization of mass murder. Yet even this carefully constructed system would eventually prove incapable of handling the immense scale of the deportations that occurred during certain periods of the war. Within the camp, prisoners were forced to carry out many of the tasks associated with the operation of the crematoria. Special prisoner units known as the Sonderkommando were assigned to work in and around the gas chambers and cremation facilities. These men were compelled to perform some of the most horrific duties imaginable: removing bodies from the gas chambers, transporting them to the ovens, and managing the disposal process under the constant supervision of SS guards. Their work was carried out under strict secrecy. The Nazi authorities attempted to ensure that few details of these operations would ever reach the outside world. Yet, despite these efforts, fragments of information gradually spread among prisoners throughout the camp. The smoke rising from the crematoria chimneys, the smell that drifted across Birkenau, and the constant arrival of new transports all contributed to a growing awareness of the camp's true purpose. Prisoners who had been assigned to labor details near the crematoria began to notice the relentless pace of the operation. Day and night, fires burned in the ovens as the Sonderkommando struggled to keep up with the grim workload forced upon them. Even with multiple crematoria operating simultaneously, the system was under constant strain. The capacity of the ovens had limits, and during periods when large numbers of transports arrived in quick succession, those limits became painfully clear. This growing pressure would eventually lead the SS to adopt additional methods for disposing of bodies, methods that would become some of the most horrifying aspects of Birkenau's history. Among these methods were the open-air burning pits that would later be dug near the crematoria when the ovens themselves could no longer keep pace. The story of those pits, and the desperate attempts to maintain the machinery of extermination even when the system began to falter, would reveal the full scale of what was happening inside Birkenau during the final years of the war. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The Expansion of Birkenau and the Machinery of Death. By the time Auschwitz-Birkenau had entered its second year of operation, the camp had grown far beyond the original plans envisioned when construction first began in the muddy fields outside the village of Brzezinka. What had started as a large prisoner camp quickly evolved into a complex system designed to serve multiple purposes within the Nazi war effort. Some sections of the camp functioned as forced labor facilities where prisoners were sent to work in nearby factories, construction projects, and agricultural fields. Other areas were reserved for the mass detention of people deported from across occupied Europe. Yet increasingly, Birkenau became known as the place where the Nazi regime carried out one of the central elements of its genocidal policy, the systematic extermination of Jewish communities. The camp's layout reflected this evolving purpose. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the flat terrain, each capable of holding hundreds of prisoners in cramped and unsanitary conditions. Many of these structures had originally been designed as horse stables, yet they were hastily converted into human living quarters as deportations increased. Inside the barracks, three-tier wooden bunks lined the walls, forcing prisoners to sleep packed tightly together with little protection from the cold winters or the oppressive heat of summer. Straw mattresses quickly became infested with insects, and disease spread easily in the overcrowded environment. Water was scarce, sanitation was minimal, and prisoners often struggled simply to survive from one day to the next. Every aspect of daily life in Birkenau was controlled by strict routines enforced by the SS guards and the prisoner functionaries placed in positions of authority. Roll calls were held at dawn and often lasted for hours as prisoners were forced to stand in rows while guards counted and recounted the population. During these assemblies, individuals who had died overnight were sometimes left lying in the rows so that the official numbers could be confirmed before their bodies were removed. After roll call, prisoners assigned to labor details marched out of the camp gates under armed supervision, heading toward work sites scattered throughout the region. Those too weak or ill to work often faced grim consequences, as the camp authorities routinely selected prisoners deemed unfit for labor to be sent to the gas chambers. The arrival of deportation trains brought new waves of prisoners into this already harsh environment. Freight wagons carrying hundreds of people at a time would roll into the camp after long journeys that sometimes lasted several days. Packed tightly inside the wagons with little food, water, or ventilation, many deportees arrived exhausted and disoriented. As the train doors were opened, SS guards shouted orders while prisoners were forced to jump down onto the gravel beside the tracks. Within minutes of arrival, a process known as selection began. SS officers, often accompanied by camp doctors, stood nearby directing prisoners into separate lines. One line consisted of individuals considered strong enough to perform labor, typically younger men and women capable of working in factories, construction, or agricultural assignments. The other line included those the Nazis deemed unable to work: elderly people, children, pregnant women, and anyone appearing too weak or sick. For these individuals, the journey had effectively reached its final destination. For those selected for labor, entry into Birkenau meant entering a brutal system of imprisonment where survival was uncertain and every day presented new challenges. Prisoners were stripped of their belongings, their hair was often shaved, and they were issued striped uniforms that marked them as inmates of the camp. Each prisoner was assigned a number, which replaced their name in the administrative records of the camp. From that moment forward, their identity was reduced to a number sewn onto their clothing and, in many cases, tattooed onto their skin. Life in the camp revolved around exhausting work assignments and constant surveillance. Prisoners were expected to perform physically demanding labor regardless of weather conditions or their physical condition. Construction projects within Birkenau continued as the camp expanded, requiring prisoners to dig trenches, carry bricks, and assemble new barracks under the watchful eyes of guards. Others were sent to work in nearby industrial facilities connected to the German war economy, including factories producing synthetic rubber and other materials. The work was grueling, and food rations were extremely limited. Most prisoners received only thin soup, small portions of bread, and occasional scraps of vegetables. These rations were far from sufficient for the level of labor demanded, and as a result, many prisoners gradually weakened from malnutrition. Illness spread easily through the camp. Diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed the lives of many prisoners who had already been weakened by starvation and exhaustion. The camp hospital blocks, known as the infirmary, offered little real treatment. In many cases, prisoners who became too sick to work were eventually selected for transport to the gas chambers. Meanwhile, beyond the barracks and work details, the crematoria complexes constructed in Birkenau continued to operate as the central mechanism of extermination. These large buildings, equipped with gas chambers and multiple ovens, were intended to process the bodies of victims killed in the camp. The SS had designed these facilities with the expectation that they could handle large numbers of people arriving from deportation trains. Yet the pace of deportations soon pushed the system to its limits. During periods when several transports arrived within a short span of time, the crematoria struggled to keep up with the volume of bodies that needed to be disposed of. This strain on the system became especially severe during the summer of 1944, when hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in a matter of weeks. The camp authorities faced a logistical problem of their own making. The machinery built to destroy human lives was now overwhelmed by the scale of the genocide itself. It was during these periods that the SS began relying more heavily on alternative methods of body disposal. One of the most disturbing of these methods involved the creation of open-air burning pits dug into the ground near the crematoria. These pits were used when the ovens could no longer process the number of victims arriving at the camp. Prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando units were forced to carry out the grim task of transporting bodies to these pits and feeding the fires that burned continuously. Thick smoke rose into the sky above Birkenau, visible from across the surrounding countryside. For prisoners living in the barracks, the sight of that smoke and the smell that accompanied it became an inescapable part of life in the camp. The burning pits were not part of the original design of Birkenau's extermination system, but they soon became a brutal extension of it, one that revealed just how immense the scale of the killings had become. Chapter 1, Segment 3. When the system began to break. By the time Birkenau reached its most intense period of operation, the camp had become a place where the machinery of mass extermination ran almost continuously. The systems built by the SS had been designed to process enormous numbers of victims, yet even those systems were based on calculations that attempted to maintain a certain level of efficiency. Gas chambers, cremation ovens, and transport logistics were organized with chilling precision. Schedules were planned, facilities expanded, and prisoner labor was exploited to maintain the operation. Yet the scale of the Holocaust during the later years of the war grew so vast that even this brutal system began to struggle under its own weight. One of the most significant turning points occurred during 1944, when deportations from Hungary brought an unprecedented number of people to Auschwitz-Birkenau in a very short period of time. During the spring and summer of that year, train after train arrived at the camp carrying Jewish families from cities, towns, and villages across Hungary. The deportations were organized with remarkable speed by the Nazi authorities and their collaborators. Within only a few weeks, hundreds of thousands of people were transported toward Auschwitz. The arrival ramp inside Birkenau became a place of constant movement and chaos as new transports reached the camp almost daily. Prisoners who had been in Birkenau for months or years watched these arrivals with growing alarm. They understood that the crematoria, already operating day and night, would soon face a volume of victims far beyond anything seen before. The crematoria complexes, which the SS had built to industrialize the process of murder, contained multiple ovens designed to burn bodies quickly. Each crematorium included several furnace chambers where corpses could be cremated simultaneously. Engineers had calculated how many bodies could be burned in a given amount of time, and the system had been organized to maintain a steady flow from the gas chambers to the ovens. Prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando were forced to operate this machinery, working in exhausting shifts under the constant supervision of SS guards. Their tasks included removing bodies from the gas chambers, transporting them to the cremation rooms, and placing them into the furnaces. The work was relentless and horrifying, carried out under threats of violence and death. Yet, as the Hungarian deportations accelerated, the crematoria began reaching the limits of what they could handle. The ovens were already running continuously, their fires burning day and night. Even with this constant operation, the number of bodies arriving from the gas chambers increased faster than the system could process them. Smoke poured from the crematorium chimneys as the furnaces operated at full capacity, but it was not enough to keep pace with the scale of the killings. Within the SS administration of the camp, officials began searching for additional ways to dispose of the growing number of bodies. Their goal was not only to maintain the efficiency of the extermination process, but also to prevent the accumulation of evidence that might expose what was happening inside the camp. It was during this moment of crisis within the system that the SS returned to a method that had been used earlier in the war: the burning of bodies in large open pits. The decision to use open-air burning pits was both practical and revealing. It showed that even the carefully designed extermination infrastructure of Birkenau could be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the genocide taking place there. Near several of the crematoria buildings, large trenches were dug into the ground. These pits were positioned in areas where smoke and flames would be less visible from outside the camp, though in reality the scale of the fires meant that they could be seen and smelled from considerable distances. Once the pits were prepared, the SS ordered Sonderkommando prisoners to begin transporting bodies to these sites. The process that followed became one of the most disturbing aspects of Birkenau's operation. Prisoners forced into these units had already been compelled to participate in the cremation process within the ovens. Now their tasks expanded to include maintaining the fires in the open pits as well. Layers of bodies were arranged carefully within the trenches, often with wood or other materials used to support the burning process. Fires were ignited and kept burning continuously as new bodies were brought forward from the gas chambers. The heat from these fires was intense, and the smoke rising from the pits formed thick clouds that drifted across the camp. Prisoners in distant barracks sometimes reported seeing the glow of the flames at night. The SS guards overseeing the operation enforced strict secrecy, threatening death to anyone who spoke about what they witnessed. Yet within the camp, it was impossible to fully hide what was happening. The scale of the burning pits made them impossible to ignore. The smell of smoke mixed with other odors that lingered in the air, creating an atmosphere that many prisoners later described as unforgettable. For those forced to work at the pits, the psychological burden was immense. The Sonderkommando prisoners lived under the constant knowledge that their role in the process made them witnesses to crimes that the SS intended to conceal from the world. At the same time, they understood that their own survival was temporary. The SS frequently replaced these prisoner units in an effort to eliminate witnesses to the extermination process. Despite these dangers, some members of the Sonderkommando secretly recorded what they saw, hiding written notes and even photographs in hopes that future generations might learn the truth about what had taken place in Birkenau. The burning pits therefore represented more than just an extension of the cremation system. They revealed the desperation of a regime attempting to maintain the pace of its own atrocities even when the infrastructure designed to carry them out could no longer keep up. In the vast fields of Birkenau, the fires burning in those pits marked a moment when the machinery of genocide began to show the strain of its unimaginable scale. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The summer of 1944, when Birkenau was overwhelmed. By the spring of 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau had already been operating as the largest killing center within the Nazi camp system for more than 2 years. The crematoria complexes had been constructed, the arrival ramp inside the camp had been completed, and the entire structure of deportation, selection, and extermination had become brutally routine. Trains arrived from across occupied Europe, carrying men, women, and children who had been forced from their homes under the orders of Nazi authorities and their collaborators. For the SS officials who managed the camp, the process had become disturbingly systematic. Transports were scheduled, victims were processed through selections within minutes of arrival, and the crematoria were expected to operate continuously to eliminate evidence of the killings. Yet in 1944, the system entered a period unlike anything it had experienced before. That year marked one of the most intense phases of deportations to Auschwitz, particularly with the arrival of Jewish communities from Hungary. In March 1944, Germany occupied Hungary after concerns that the Hungarian government might attempt to negotiate peace with the Allies. Almost immediately, the Nazi leadership began organizing the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. The speed with which these deportations were carried out stunned even some German officials. Within only a few weeks, the Hungarian railway system was mobilized to transport entire communities toward Poland. Trains carrying thousands of people departed almost daily, often consisting of long lines of freight wagons sealed shut from the outside. Inside these wagons were families who had been given little explanation of where they were going. Many had been told they were being relocated for work, while others had only fragments of information about camps somewhere in the east. The journey itself was brutal. Packed tightly into the wagons, deportees endured long days without adequate food, water, or sanitation. Elderly passengers, young children, and the sick often struggled to survive the journey. By the time the trains reached Auschwitz-Birkenau, many passengers were already exhausted or severely weakened. When the doors were finally opened upon arrival, prisoners were forced to climb down quickly as guards shouted orders and dogs barked around them. The arrival ramp at Birkenau became the center of this activity. Throughout the spring and summer of 1944, transport after transport arrived at the camp, sometimes several in a single day. For prisoners already living inside Birkenau, the sight of these trains became a grim routine. They could see the wagons pulling into the camp, hear the shouting of guards, and watch the crowds of new arrivals being assembled along the tracks. Within minutes, the SS began the process of selection. Lines were formed, and prisoners were directed to move either to the left or to the right based on decisions made by SS officers and camp doctors. For many of the deportees, these brief moments determined their fate. Those considered able to work were sent into the camp's barracks and labor system. But for the majority, especially children, elderly people, and many women, the selections led directly toward the gas chambers. The pace of these deportations soon pushed the Birkenau extermination system beyond anything it had previously experienced. The 4 crematoria complexes had been designed to operate simultaneously, each containing multiple ovens capable of burning bodies throughout the day and night. In theory, this system allowed the SS to process large numbers of victims while maintaining the appearance of efficiency and control. Prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando units worked in shifts to keep the process moving, removing bodies from the gas chambers, transporting them to the cremation rooms, and feeding the furnaces that burned continuously. The heat from the ovens often filled the crematoria buildings, and the chimneys released thick smoke into the air above the camp. Yet even with all 4 crematoria operating, the system was never designed to handle the immense surge of deportations that arrived during the Hungarian transports. Day after day, trains continued to reach the camp, bringing thousands of new victims. The selections on the arrival ramp were carried out quickly in order to keep the process moving. Those chosen for the gas chambers were led away toward the crematoria buildings with little explanation of what awaited them. In many cases, they were told they would undergo disinfection or showers before being assigned to work. Meanwhile, the Sonderkommando units struggled to keep up with the bodies emerging from the gas chambers. The ovens burned constantly, yet the volume of victims arriving during this period grew so large that the crematoria alone could no longer handle the workload. The SS authorities overseeing the camp faced a grim logistical problem. Their entire system depended on the rapid disposal of bodies in order to maintain the pace of extermination and prevent evidence from accumulating. If the bodies could not be burned quickly enough, the system risked slowing down, creating chaos within the camp's operations. To avoid this outcome, the SS resorted to methods that expanded beyond the original design of the crematoria complexes. It was during these months in 1944 that open-air burning pits were dug near the crematoria grounds. These pits functioned as large trenches where bodies could be burned when the ovens were overwhelmed. Sonderkommando prisoners were ordered to transport corpses from the gas chambers to these pits, stacking them in layers and maintaining the fires that burned continuously. Flames rose high above the trenches, and thick smoke drifted across the camp and the surrounding countryside. For prisoners watching from distant barracks, the sight of those fires became an unmistakable sign that the crematoria system had been pushed beyond its limits. The burning pits revealed the scale of the genocide unfolding at Birkenau during that summer. What had once been a system designed for industrial efficiency was now straining under the weight of the crimes it had been created to carry out. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The Arrival Ramp and the Endless Trains. During the peak months of deportations in 1944, the arrival ramp inside Auschwitz-Birkenau became one of the most active and chaotic places within the entire camp complex. The railway line that extended directly into Birkenau had been constructed specifically to allow trains carrying deportees to enter the camp itself. Before the railway extension was completed, transports had arrived at a station outside the camp, where prisoners were forced to march several kilometers to reach Birkenau. But once the tracks were extended through the main gate of the camp, trains could roll directly into the center of the extermination complex. This change dramatically increased the speed with which deportations could be processed. Now entire transports could be unloaded only a short distance from the areas where selections took place and where victims were directed toward the crematoria. For the SS authorities running the camp, this railway connection made the entire system more efficient and more controlled. For the victims arriving inside those freight wagons, it meant that their final moments unfolded almost immediately after the train stopped moving. The trains themselves were long lines of sealed freight cars, often designed originally for transporting livestock or cargo rather than people. Inside each wagon, dozens of individuals were forced to stand or sit tightly packed together during the journey. In many cases, there were no seats, no proper ventilation, and only a single bucket provided as a toilet for the entire group. The journeys could last for days, especially for transports coming from distant regions of Europe. During that time, the deportees were given little food or water. The conditions inside the wagons quickly became unbearable, particularly during the summer months when the heat intensified the suffering of those trapped inside. By the time the trains reached Auschwitz-Birkenau, many passengers were exhausted, dehydrated, and confused about what awaited them. When the train doors finally slid open, SS guards and camp personnel shouted orders for everyone to disembark quickly. Prisoners already living in the camp were sometimes forced to assist in unloading the wagons, helping deportees climb down onto the gravel beside the tracks. Families tried to stay together as they gathered their belongings, but confusion spread quickly as guards began directing people toward specific areas of the ramp. The SS officers responsible for selections took up positions nearby, often accompanied by camp doctors who helped determine who would be sent to forced labor and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. The process moved with disturbing speed. Individuals were ordered into separate lines, men in one group, women and children in another. As the lines moved forward, SS officers made rapid decisions with simple gestures of the hand, directing people either to the left or to the right. To the prisoners arriving for the first time, these gestures seemed arbitrary and mysterious. Few understood that these decisions determined whether they would live temporarily as forced laborers or die within hours inside the gas chambers. For prisoners already held inside Birkenau, the arrival ramp became a place where the full scale of the camp's operations was visible. From certain areas of the camp, they could see the trains entering through the main gate and hear the sounds of unloading as deportees were forced down from the wagons. Some prisoners assigned to labor details near the ramp witnessed the selections directly, observing the hurried decisions made by SS officers as thousands of people were processed in only a few hours. These prisoners understood the meaning of the selections far more clearly than the newcomers arriving from the trains. They knew that the majority of those directed away from the labor lines would soon be led toward the crematoria complexes located deeper inside Birkenau. The selections themselves were carried out with an efficiency that reflected the SS determination to keep the system moving. The deportation trains often arrived one after another, sometimes several within the same day. If the selections took too long, the entire schedule of the camp could be disrupted. As a result, SS officers often made their decisions based on only a quick glance at each individual's physical condition. Young adults who appeared strong enough to work were typically sent to the labor side. Older individuals, children, and anyone who appeared weak or ill were usually directed toward the other path. In many cases, families were separated within seconds. Parents were divided from children, husbands from wives, siblings from one another. Guards discouraged conversation and demanded that the lines keep moving forward. For the victims, there was little opportunity to understand what was happening or to resist the process unfolding around them. Once the selections were complete, the two groups were sent in different directions. Those chosen for labor were marched toward registration areas where they would undergo the procedures that turned them into prisoners of the camp: shaving, disinfection, and the assignment of numbers that replaced their names. But those who had been selected for death were led along roads that eventually reached the crematoria buildings. Many were told that they were going to shower or undergo medical inspection before being assigned work. In reality, they were being guided toward the gas chambers. As the number of transports increased during the Hungarian deportations, the arrival ramp became a place of relentless movement. Prisoners assigned to Sonderkommando units sometimes observed the aftermath of these selections when bodies from the gas chambers were brought to the crematoria. At times when the cremation ovens could not process the volume of victims quickly enough, the bodies were transported to the open-air burning pits near the crematoria grounds. The fires burning in those pits became visible reminders of how overwhelmed the extermination system had become. Smoke drifted across the camp and into the surrounding countryside, carried by the wind far beyond the barbed wire fences of Birkenau. For those trapped inside the camp, the arrival ramp symbolized the beginning of a process that ended only a short distance away, where the fires of the burning pits and the chimneys of the crematoria revealed the true purpose of the camp. Chapter 2, Segment 3. When the crematoria couldn't keep up. By the summer of 1944, the extermination system at Auschwitz-Birkenau had reached a moment of extreme pressure unlike anything seen earlier in the camp's history. For years, the SS had constructed and refined a network of gas chambers and crematoria designed to carry out mass murder with terrifying efficiency. The 4 crematoria complexes at Birkenau, large buildings equipped with gas chambers and multiple furnace ovens, had been built with the specific purpose of processing the bodies of victims killed inside the camp. Their construction represented the Nazi regime's attempt to industrialize extermination, turning murder into a process managed through planning, engineering, and forced labor. Yet even this system, brutal as it was, had limits. The deportations of Hungarian Jews during the spring and summer of 1944 pushed those limits to the breaking point. Train after train arrived at Birkenau, often carrying thousands of people in a single transport. Many days saw several trains arriving within hours of one another. Each arrival set into motion the same sequence of events: unloading on the arrival ramp, selections carried out by SS officers, and the movement of those chosen for death toward the crematoria. For the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to operate the cremation facilities, the workload became almost unimaginable. These prisoners, themselves victims of the camp system, were compelled under threat of death to assist in the disposal of bodies from the gas chambers. Their tasks were carried out in strict secrecy, overseen constantly by SS guards who ensured the work continued without interruption. Inside the crematoria buildings, the ovens burned continuously. Bodies were placed into the furnaces in rapid succession as the Sonderkommando attempted to keep pace with the volume of victims arriving from the gas chambers. The heat inside these rooms was intense, and the work was physically exhausting. The chimneys above the crematoria released thick smoke into the sky as the ovens operated day and night. But even with this relentless effort, the crematoria began to fall behind. The design of the ovens allowed for a certain number of bodies to be burned within a given period of time. When the deportations from Hungary reached their peak, however, the number of victims arriving at Birkenau exceeded what the cremation system had been built to handle. The SS administrators overseeing the camp faced a logistical problem. If the bodies could not be disposed of quickly enough, the entire extermination process would slow down. For a system designed around speed and secrecy, such delays were unacceptable. It was under these conditions that the SS turned increasingly to a method that had been used earlier in the camp's history but now became essential to maintaining the pace of the killings. This method involved the use of large open-air burning pits dug into the ground near the crematoria complexes. The burning pits represented a grim extension of the extermination system already operating at Birkenau. These pits were essentially large trenches excavated in the earth close to the crematoria buildings. Their purpose was to allow bodies to be burned outdoors when the cremation ovens were overwhelmed by the sheer number of victims. Once the pits were prepared, Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to transport corpses from the gas chambers and crematoria areas to these trenches. The process that followed was both brutal and methodical. Bodies were arranged in layers inside the pits, often alternating with materials that helped sustain the fire. Once the fires were ignited, they were kept burning continuously, sometimes for many hours or even days at a time. The flames from these pits could rise high above the ground, and thick smoke poured into the air above Birkenau. Prisoners housed in distant sections of the camp often saw the smoke drifting across the sky and smelled the heavy odor that accompanied it. For them, the burning pits became a visible sign that the extermination process had expanded beyond the crematoria themselves. The use of these pits revealed the enormous scale of the genocide taking place during that period. The crematoria had already been designed to operate with industrial efficiency, yet even they could not keep pace with the volume of victims arriving from the deportation trains. The SS authorities running the camp viewed the burning pits as a practical solution to a logistical challenge. Their goal remained the same: to eliminate evidence of the killings as quickly as possible while maintaining the continuous operation of the extermination system. For the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work at the pits, the experience was harrowing. They worked under constant guard, performing tasks that exposed them directly to the full reality of what was happening inside Birkenau. Many of these prisoners understood that their role placed them in an especially dangerous position. The SS frequently replaced Sonderkommando units after periods of time in order to eliminate witnesses to the extermination process. Despite this danger, some members of these units attempted to document what they saw. Secret notes were written and hidden in containers buried near the crematoria grounds. In some cases, prisoners even managed to take photographs showing the burning pits and the work being carried out there. These fragments of evidence would later become crucial historical records, helping investigators understand the scale of the crimes committed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The burning pits therefore served two roles within the camp's history. On one level, they were simply an extension of the extermination system, a brutal method used when the crematoria could no longer keep up. But on another level, they became silent witnesses to the magnitude of the genocide unfolding in Birkenau during 1944, revealing a moment when even the machinery designed for mass murder was overwhelmed by the sheer number of victims. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The Sonderkommando, prisoners forced into the system. Within the vast and tightly controlled world of Auschwitz-Birkenau, there existed a group of prisoners whose role placed them closer than anyone else to the core of the camp's extermination machinery. These prisoners were known as the Sonderkommando. The term itself simply meant special unit, but within the context of the camp, it referred to a group of inmates forced by the SS to work directly in the gas chambers and crematoria. Their existence reflected the grim structure of the Nazi camp system, where victims themselves were often coerced into carrying out the most brutal tasks under constant threat of death. The Sonderkommando were not volunteers. They were selected from newly arrived prisoners or sometimes transferred from other parts of the camp when the SS required more labor inside the crematoria complexes. The selection was sudden and rarely explained. Prisoners chosen for this work were separated from others and taken to areas near the crematoria where they were placed under strict supervision. Once assigned to the Sonderkommando, their daily lives became tied completely to the operation of the extermination facilities. They lived in isolated barracks close to the crematoria buildings, separated from the main prisoner population. This isolation served two purposes for the SS authorities. First, it allowed the guards to maintain tight control over the units, ensuring the work continued without interruption. Second, it limited the spread of information about what was happening inside the crematoria. The Nazis attempted to keep the details of the extermination process hidden even from many prisoners within the camp. But the Sonderkommando knew more than anyone else. They witnessed the process from beginning to end. Their duties began immediately after victims were forced into the gas chambers. Once the SS guards sealed the doors and released the poison gas, the Sonderkommando waited outside until the killing process was complete. Afterward, they were ordered to open the chambers and begin removing the bodies. This was the first stage of their work. Inside the gas chambers, the prisoners encountered scenes of immense suffering and desperation. Bodies were often piled near the doors where victims had struggled in their final moments to escape the gas. The Sonderkommando were forced to disentangle these bodies and carry them out of the chambers, transporting them toward the cremation rooms where the ovens awaited. The work was physically demanding and emotionally devastating. Yet refusal was impossible. SS guards overseeing the process enforced strict discipline and responded harshly to any sign of resistance. After removing the bodies from the gas chambers, the Sonderkommando performed additional tasks as part of the extermination system. They were ordered to search the bodies for hidden valuables such as jewelry or gold teeth. These items were collected by the SS and added to the vast amount of property confiscated from victims arriving at the camp. Once this process was complete, the bodies were transported toward the cremation ovens where they were burned. The Sonderkommando worked in teams to load the furnaces, operating the crematoria almost continuously during periods of intense deportations. The ovens themselves generated tremendous heat, and the rooms housing them became suffocating environments where prisoners worked long hours under constant pressure to maintain the pace demanded by the SS. The lives of the Sonderkommando prisoners were shaped by a strange and tragic contradiction. On one hand, they received slightly better living conditions than many other prisoners in Birkenau. Their food rations were sometimes marginally larger, and they were allowed access to certain supplies not available to the general prisoner population. These privileges were not given out of compassion. Instead, they served a practical purpose for the SS. The work carried out by the Sonderkommando required a certain level of physical strength and endurance, and the camp authorities needed these prisoners to remain capable of performing their tasks. Yet, despite these minor differences, the Sonderkommando remained prisoners under the same brutal system of control that governed the rest of the camp. They lived under constant surveillance, surrounded by guards who made it clear that their lives could be ended at any moment. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of their existence was the knowledge that their role made them witnesses to crimes the SS intended to keep secret. The Nazis understood that anyone who had worked inside the gas chambers and crematoria possessed knowledge that could expose the reality of what was happening at Auschwitz-Birkenau. For this reason, Sonderkommando units were periodically replaced. Prisoners who had been assigned to these units for some time were often executed and replaced with new arrivals who could continue the work without knowledge of earlier operations. This cycle created an atmosphere of constant fear within the Sonderkommando barracks. Prisoners understood that their survival was temporary and uncertain. Despite these conditions, some members of the Sonderkommando found ways to resist in small but meaningful ways. They recognized that the SS was attempting to erase evidence of the extermination process, and they understood the importance of preserving the truth about what was happening inside the camp. Some prisoners secretly wrote down their experiences on scraps of paper or notebooks, describing the work they had been forced to perform. These writings were carefully hidden, often buried in containers near the crematoria grounds in the hope that they might one day be discovered. In one remarkable instance, members of the Sonderkommando even managed to take photographs inside the camp. Using a camera secretly obtained through contacts with resistance groups within the camp, they captured images showing the burning pits and the process of body disposal taking place outside the crematoria buildings. These photographs were smuggled out of the camp and eventually reached the outside world. Today, they remain among the few visual records of the extermination process at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The existence of these photographs demonstrates the determination of some Sonderkommando prisoners to document what they were witnessing despite the enormous risks involved. Their actions ensured that evidence of the crimes committed at Birkenau would survive even after the war ended. Through their hidden writings and photographs, the Sonderkommando helped preserve the memory of those who were murdered in the camp and provided historians with invaluable insight into the operation of one of the most devastating systems of mass murder in human history. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Life and Survival Inside the Sonderkommando Units. The prisoners forced into the Sonderkommando units at Auschwitz-Birkenau lived within a strange and tragic corner of the camp system. While every prisoner in Birkenau faced hunger, fear, and the constant threat of death, the Sonderkommando existed in a position unlike any other group. They were compelled to work directly inside the crematoria and near the gas chambers, performing tasks that exposed them to the most horrifying realities of the extermination process. Because of this role, the SS authorities kept these units physically separated from the rest of the camp population. Their barracks were located close to the crematoria complexes so that the prisoners could be summoned quickly whenever transports arrived and the gas chambers were used. Guards closely monitored their movements, and contact with other prisoners was restricted as much as possible. The isolation was deliberate. The SS leadership understood that these prisoners knew far more about the extermination process than anyone else inside the camp. Limiting their interactions reduced the chances that detailed information about the gas chambers and cremation operations would spread widely through the camp population. For the Sonderkommando prisoners, this isolation created a difficult and emotionally complex existence. On one hand, they lived slightly apart from the daily routines of labor assignments that dominated life for most prisoners in Birkenau. They did not march out to factories or construction sites each morning. Instead, their work was concentrated entirely within the crematoria area. When transports arrived and selections were carried out on the arrival ramp, they were often called to begin their duties soon afterward. During quieter periods between transports, the units remained in their barracks under guard, waiting for the next order to begin work again. Their daily lives therefore revolved around an unpredictable schedule determined by the arrival of deportation trains. When large transports reached the camp, the Sonderkommando units could be forced to work for many hours without rest as the crematoria operated at full capacity. During such times, the prisoners moved continuously between different stages of the process, removing bodies from the gas chambers, transporting them to the ovens, maintaining the fires, and clearing the cremation rooms so the next group could be processed. The physical strain was immense. The heat generated by the cremation ovens created suffocating conditions inside the buildings, especially during the summer months when temperatures were already high. The prisoners working there had to endure these conditions while carrying out tasks that demanded constant physical effort. Yet the psychological burden of the work was even heavier. The Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to witness the suffering of victims at extremely close range. They saw families arriving at the gas chambers, often still unaware of what awaited them. They saw the aftermath inside the chambers once the doors were opened, and they were compelled to continue their work despite the emotional weight of these experiences. Many later described how they tried to detach themselves mentally from what was happening in order to survive day by day. Despite the horrific nature of their work, the Sonderkommando prisoners formed small communities among themselves, bound together by shared experience and the knowledge that only they fully understood what was happening inside the crematoria. These groups developed their own forms of solidarity as a way to cope with the circumstances they faced. Some prisoners supported one another emotionally, offering quiet encouragement or conversation during the rare moments when work slowed and guards were less attentive. Others tried to preserve fragments of normal human behavior, sharing stories about their families, recalling memories from life before the war, or discussing hopes that the conflict might eventually end. These acts of human connection became small forms of resistance against the dehumanizing environment imposed by the camp authorities. Within these communities, prisoners also began to think about how they might document the crimes they were witnessing. Many understood that the SS intended to eliminate them eventually in order to erase evidence of the extermination process. This knowledge created a powerful motivation to leave behind records of what had happened at Birkenau. Some Sonderkommando members secretly wrote diaries or testimonies describing the daily operations of the crematoria and the burning pits used when the ovens could not keep up. These writings were hidden carefully, often buried in containers near the crematoria grounds with the hope that they might be discovered after the war. In a few extraordinary cases, prisoners even attempted to gather visual evidence. Through contact with resistance networks inside the camp, members of the Sonderkommando managed to obtain a small camera. Using it required enormous courage and careful planning. The photographs had to be taken quickly and secretly, often from hidden positions near the crematoria. Several images were eventually captured, showing scenes that revealed the reality of what was happening at Birkenau. These photographs were later smuggled out of the camp and delivered to resistance groups beyond the barbed wire fences. They remain among the most significant pieces of visual evidence documenting the Holocaust. The actions of these prisoners demonstrated that even in the most oppressive conditions, individuals sought ways to preserve truth and memory. At the same time, the Sonderkommando lived with the constant fear that their unit would soon be replaced. The SS periodically executed members of these units in order to eliminate witnesses. New prisoners would then be selected to take their place and continue the work. This brutal cycle meant that survival within the Sonderkommando was often temporary. Yet despite the danger, many prisoners continued their efforts to record what they had seen. Their hidden notes and photographs would later provide historians and investigators with critical insight into the functioning of the extermination system at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Through these fragile pieces of evidence, the voices of those who witnessed the burning pits and the crematoria could still be heard long after the camp itself was liberated. Chapter 3, Segment 3. Witnesses to the Fires. Among all the prisoners held inside Auschwitz-Birkenau, the members of the Sonderkommando were the closest witnesses to the inner workings of the extermination system. They saw what happened behind the doors of the gas chambers, inside the crematoria, and around the burning pits that operated when the ovens could no longer keep up with the scale of the killings. Because of this, their existence became a threat to the SS administration itself. The Nazi leadership understood that the people forced to carry out these tasks possessed direct knowledge of the crimes taking place inside the camp. If such witnesses survived the war, they could reveal details about the extermination process that the SS hoped to keep hidden forever. As a result, the Sonderkommando units lived with the constant awareness that their lives were considered temporary. The SS regularly replaced these units after periods of time, executing the prisoners who had been forced to perform the work and selecting new arrivals to take their place. This brutal practice ensured that the extermination process could continue while reducing the number of long-term witnesses to it. For the prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando, this knowledge shaped every aspect of their existence. They understood that survival depended not only on enduring the physical demands of the work, but also on navigating the constant danger posed by the guards overseeing them. Despite this, many members of these units began to think about how they could leave evidence of what was happening inside Birkenau. The desire to record the truth became especially strong during the months when the crematoria were overwhelmed and the open-air burning pits were in constant use. The sight of the fires, the smoke drifting across the camp, and the relentless pace of the extermination process made it clear to the prisoners that they were witnessing events of enormous historical significance. Some Sonderkommando prisoners began secretly writing accounts of their experiences. Using scraps of paper or pieces of notebooks obtained through contacts with other prisoners, they recorded descriptions of the gas chambers, the cremation ovens, and the burning pits. These writings were often created under extremely dangerous conditions. Prisoners had to conceal their notes carefully, hiding them from guards who frequently searched the barracks and work areas. Once completed, the documents were buried in containers or wrapped in protective materials and hidden in the ground near the crematoria. The prisoners hoped that if they did not survive, someone might eventually discover these records and learn the truth about what had happened there. These buried writings would later become known as the Scrolls of Auschwitz, and they remain some of the most powerful testimonies left by prisoners forced into the Sonderkommando units. Alongside these written testimonies, one of the most remarkable acts of resistance carried out by the Sonderkommando involved the creation of photographic evidence. Taking photographs inside Auschwitz-Birkenau was strictly forbidden, and the SS took great care to control cameras and photographic equipment within the camp. Yet, through connections with resistance networks among prisoners working in other sections of the camp, a small camera was eventually obtained by members of the Sonderkommando. The prisoners who participated in this effort understood the enormous risk they were taking. If they were discovered, they would almost certainly be executed immediately. Nevertheless, they proceeded with the plan because they believed that visual evidence could help prove the reality of the crimes being committed at Birkenau. The photographs were taken secretly during moments when the guards were distracted or when the prisoners could position themselves in locations partially hidden from view. Some of the images captured the burning pits near the crematoria, where bodies were being disposed of in open-air fires. Others showed prisoners working around the pits, carrying out the tasks forced upon them by the SS. The photographs were taken quickly and under difficult conditions, which is why they appear blurred or partially obscured. But despite their imperfect quality, these images remain among the most important visual records of the extermination process at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Once the photographs were taken, they had to be smuggled out of the camp. This required cooperation between the Sonderkommando and members of underground resistance groups operating within Auschwitz. The film was hidden carefully and passed through a chain of prisoners until it eventually reached individuals who could send it beyond the camp's barbed wire fences. From there, The images made their way into the hands of resistance organizations and eventually reached the outside world. The survival of these photographs represents a remarkable achievement given the extreme security measures in place at the camp. Together with the hidden written testimonies, they ensured that the events taking place around the crematoria and burning pits would not disappear without record. The Sonderkommando prisoners who risked their lives to produce this evidence understood that they might never live to see the end of the war. Yet their actions demonstrated a powerful determination to preserve the truth. Even within the harshest environment imaginable, they sought ways to resist the SS effort to erase the evidence of mass murder. Today, historians studying the Holocaust rely heavily on these testimonies and photographs to reconstruct the history of Birkenau's extermination system. Through the courage of the prisoners who created them, the voices of those forced to work in the shadow of the crematoria continue to speak across the decades, reminding the world of what took place in that camp and ensuring that the fires of the burning pits are never forgotten. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The Burning Pits, an extension of the crematoria. As the deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau intensified during 1944, the extermination system within the camp entered a period of extreme strain. For years, the SS had attempted to build a system that combined efficiency with concealment. Gas chambers were constructed to kill large groups of people quickly, while crematoria ovens were designed to destroy the bodies in a way that left as little evidence as possible. These facilities formed the central mechanism of mass murder within Birkenau. Yet the Nazis had calculated the capacity of the crematoria based on assumptions about how many transports would arrive and how quickly the process could operate. When those assumptions were exceeded, the system began to falter. The arrival of massive transports from Hungary in the spring and summer of 1944 created precisely this situation. Train after train entered the camp, each carrying thousands of victims. The pace of deportations was so rapid that the crematoria complexes were pushed beyond their designed limits. The ovens burned constantly, yet the number of bodies emerging from the gas chambers continued to grow faster than they could be processed. The SS authorities overseeing Birkenau faced a problem that revealed the scale of the crime they were committing. The machinery of extermination was no longer sufficient to keep up with the volume of victims arriving at the camp. It was in response to this crisis that the SS expanded the use of open-air burning pits near the crematoria grounds. These pits were not entirely new to the Auschwitz system. Earlier in the camp's history, similar methods had been used when cremation facilities were not yet fully developed. However, by 1944, the crematoria were supposed to serve as the primary means of body disposal. The return to open-air burning demonstrated just how overwhelmed the system had become. Large trenches were dug in areas close to the crematoria buildings, especially near Crematoria IV and V. These pits were excavated by prisoners under the supervision of guards and prepared to function as massive outdoor cremation sites. Once they were ready, Sonderkommando units were ordered to begin transporting bodies from the gas chambers and crematoria to these trenches. The process required careful coordination, as bodies were brought in large numbers and arranged inside the pits in layers. Fires were then ignited and maintained continuously in order to ensure that the bodies burned as completely as possible. The flames from these pits often rose high above the ground, and thick smoke drifted across the Birkenau camp complex. For prisoners living in distant barracks, the sight of that smoke became a constant reminder of what was happening near the crematoria. At night, the glow of the fires could sometimes be seen from across the camp. The burning pits were therefore not only an extension of the cremation system, but also a visible symbol of how the extermination process had reached unprecedented levels of intensity. The operation of the burning pits required the forced labor of Sonderkommando prisoners who had already been compelled to work inside the crematoria buildings. These units were responsible for carrying out every stage of the process under the strict supervision of SS guards. Once bodies were removed from the gas chambers, they were transported either to the cremation ovens or, when those ovens were full, directly to the pits. Prisoners used stretchers, carts, or simple manual labor to move the bodies across the crematoria grounds. The scale of the work was immense, especially during the height of the Hungarian deportations when thousands of victims were killed each day. Maintaining the fires in the pits also required constant effort. The flames had to be kept burning at high temperatures to ensure that the bodies were reduced as completely as possible. Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to tend these fires for long hours, adding fuel and adjusting the arrangement of the bodies in order to keep the burning process going. The work was physically exhausting and carried out under the watchful eyes of guards who demanded speed and obedience. The heat from the pits was intense, particularly during the summer months. Prisoners working near the fires often endured extreme conditions, surrounded by smoke and ash as they carried out their tasks. Despite the SS efforts to hide what was happening in Birkenau, the burning pits produced smoke that could be seen far beyond the crematoria grounds. Some prisoners later recalled that the smell from the pits drifted across the camp and lingered in the air for long periods of time. In nearby villages outside the camp perimeter, local residents sometimes reported seeing the smoke rising from the direction of Birkenau. Although the Nazi authorities attempted to maintain secrecy about the extermination process, the scale of the burning pits made it increasingly difficult to conceal the reality of what was happening there. The use of these pits also reflected the SS determination to continue the extermination process regardless of logistical obstacles. Even when the crematoria ovens could not keep up, the killings continued without interruption. The pits allowed the SS to dispose of bodies more quickly during periods when the gas chambers were operating at maximum capacity. For the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to carry out this work, the pits became one of the most haunting aspects of life inside Birkenau. They were daily witnesses to the fires that burned almost without pause during those months in 1944. The burning pits revealed the scale of the genocide unfolding at Auschwitz-Birkenau in a way that even the crematoria buildings themselves could not fully hide. They showed that the system designed to industrialize extermination had reached a point where even its own machinery was no longer sufficient to handle the magnitude of the crime. Chapter 4, Segment 2. The work around the burning pits. Once the burning pits began operating near the crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau, they quickly became an essential part of the extermination process during the months when the camp was overwhelmed by deportations. The pits were not temporary measures used for only a few days. During the peak period of transports in 1944, they functioned almost continuously as extensions of the crematoria system. Their operation required an organized routine carried out by Sonderkommando prisoners who had already been forced into the grim work of the crematoria buildings. For these prisoners, the pits represented yet another stage of labor imposed upon them within the machinery of extermination. Each day the process followed a similar pattern that reflected the relentless rhythm of the camp itself. When new transports arrived and selections were completed on the ramp, those sent to the gas chambers were taken to the crematoria buildings. After the killing process ended, Sonderkommando units entered the chambers to begin removing the bodies. Normally these bodies would be transported directly to the ovens, but during periods when the crematoria were already operating at full capacity, the prisoners were ordered to move many of the corpses toward the pits instead. This task was physically demanding. Bodies had to be carried or dragged across the crematoria grounds and lowered into the trenches where the fires were burning. The pits themselves were large excavations in the earth, often several meters deep and wide enough to hold hundreds of bodies at a time. Prisoners working there had to arrange the bodies carefully in layers to ensure that the fire would burn effectively. The arrangement of these layers was not random. Sonderkommando prisoners learned through grim experience how the fires behaved and how bodies burned within the pits. They were forced to organize the process in ways that allowed the flames to spread through the layers as quickly as possible. Wood and other materials were sometimes placed between the bodies to help sustain the fire. Once the pit was filled, the the flames were ignited or maintained so that the burning process continued without interruption. The work around the pits was constant during periods of heavy deportations. Fires burned day and night as prisoners moved bodies into the trenches and tended the flames. The heat radiating from the pits created difficult conditions for the prisoners working nearby. Combined with the smoke rising from the fires, the environment became suffocating at times. Yet the prisoners were given little opportunity to rest. Guards demanded that the work continue quickly so that the system of extermination would not slow down. The pits therefore became places where the pace of the killings was visible in the most direct way. When transports arrived in large numbers, the fires grew larger and the work around them intensified. When deportations slowed temporarily, the pits burned less frequently. But during the summer of 1944, the flames were almost constant. The presence of the burning pits changed the atmosphere of Birkenau in ways that could be seen and sensed throughout the camp. Smoke rising from the trenches often drifted across the camp complex, carried by the wind over the rows of barracks and guard towers. Prisoners living in distant sections of the camp sometimes reported seeing the dark columns of smoke stretching upward into the sky. The odor from the fires also spread across the area, lingering in the air and reminding prisoners of what was taking place near the crematoria. For many inmates, the pits became a symbol of how the extermination process had expanded beyond the buildings originally constructed for that purpose. Even though the SS attempted to maintain secrecy around the operations of the crematoria, the burning pits were difficult to conceal completely. Their scale made them visible from several points within Birkenau, and the smoke they produced could sometimes be seen from outside the camp as well. In nearby villages beyond the barbed wire fences, residents occasionally reported seeing unusual smoke rising from the direction of the camp. While the Nazi authorities tried to disguise the true nature of their activities, the presence of these fires created signs that something extraordinary was happening within the boundaries of Auschwitz-Birkenau. For the Sonderkommando prisoners working directly at the pits, the experience was both physically exhausting and emotionally overwhelming. They were forced to remain near the fires for long hours, adjusting the arrangement of bodies and ensuring that the burning process continued. The heat from the pits could be intense, especially during warm weather. Ash and smoke filled the air, coating the surrounding ground with dark residue. Yet the guards supervising the work showed little concern for the conditions faced by the prisoners. Their only priority was maintaining the pace of the extermination process. Despite these circumstances, some members of the Sonderkommando continued their quiet efforts to document what was happening. They understood that the burning pits were evidence of how the extermination system had expanded during the Hungarian deportations. In hidden writings and secret testimonies, they described the pits and the work carried out there, hoping that these records might survive even if they themselves did not. Their accounts would later help historians understand how the extermination process functioned during the most intense period of killings at Birkenau. The burning pits therefore became more than just a practical solution to a logistical problem. They represented a moment when the machinery of extermination reached a scale so vast that even the crematoria ovens could not keep pace. The fires that burned in those trenches revealed the full magnitude of the crimes unfolding within the camp during the final years of the war. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Smoke over Birkenau. As the burning pits continued to operate during the height of deportations in 1944, the atmosphere within Auschwitz-Birkenau changed in ways that many prisoners later described as impossible to forget. The camp had already been a place of constant suffering, overcrowding, and fear, but the presence of the pits created new signs that the extermination process had expanded beyond the crematoria buildings themselves. Smoke rose steadily from the trenches where the fires burned, drifting across the camp and sometimes spreading far beyond its fences. For prisoners living in the barracks scattered across Birkenau, this smoke became part of the daily landscape. Some remembered how the sky above the crematoria often appeared darker than usual, especially during days when several transports had arrived and the pits were working at full capacity. At night, the glow of flames could sometimes be seen from distant parts of the camp, flickering against the horizon where the crematoria stood. These sights and smells created an atmosphere that reinforced what many prisoners already suspected about the camp's true purpose. Although the SS attempted to hide the full reality of the extermination process, the burning pits made secrecy increasingly difficult. Prisoners could see the smoke rising from the area and understand that the crematoria were no longer able to keep up with the number of victims arriving at Birkenau. For those forced to work within the Sonderkommando units, the experience of tending the pits left deep impressions that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The fires burned for long periods, often requiring constant attention to maintain the temperature needed to destroy the bodies placed within the trenches. Prisoners working there were ordered to move continuously between tasks, carrying bodies to the pits, adjusting the layers of the fire, and ensuring that the flames continued burning. The heat radiating from the pits combined with the smoke and ash in the air created extremely difficult conditions for anyone working nearby. Yet the guards supervising the area demanded that the work proceed without interruption. For them, the pits were simply another tool used to maintain the efficiency of the extermination process. Beyond the crematoria grounds, other prisoners could sense that something unusual was happening even if they did not fully understand the details. Many inmates in Birkenau had already begun to realize that the camp functioned as a place of mass killing, particularly after witnessing repeated selections and the disappearance of newly arrived transports. The burning pits added another layer to this awareness. The smoke and flames made the scale of the operation visible in ways that could not easily be hidden behind the walls of the crematoria buildings. Even those prisoners who had never seen the pits directly often spoke later about the smell that drifted across the camp during that summer. It became part of the environment in which they lived, an inescapable reminder of the crimes unfolding nearby. Outside the immediate area of the crematoria, the smoke from the burning pits sometimes reached locations beyond the camp itself. Birkenau was surrounded by small villages and farmland, and although the SS attempted to keep the extermination process concealed, the fires produced visible signs that occasionally drew attention from the surrounding region. Residents living in nearby areas sometimes reported seeing unusual smoke rising from the direction of the camp. While many could not know exactly what was happening inside the guarded perimeter, the persistent smoke and the scale of activity suggested that something significant was taking place behind the fences. The Nazi authorities were aware of this visibility and attempted to manage it as best they could. Guards restricted access to areas near the crematoria, and prisoners were warned not to discuss what they saw. Yet the presence of the burning pits remained difficult to hide completely. Their operation required constant movement of prisoners and bodies across the crematoria grounds, and the smoke they produced often spread across the surrounding landscape. Within the camp, the existence of the pits also reinforced the psychological pressure placed upon the Sonderkommando units. The prisoners assigned to these units understood that they were being forced to participate in a system designed to eliminate evidence of mass murder. They knew that their work in the crematoria and pits helped the SS maintain the secrecy of the extermination process. At the same time, they recognized that their own lives were constantly at risk because of the knowledge they possessed. The SS frequently replaced Sonderkommando units to prevent long-term witnesses from surviving. This knowledge created a sense of urgency among some members of the units who attempted to record what they saw. Hidden writings describing the burning pits and the cremation process were buried near the crematoria grounds in hopes that they might be discovered later. These documents later became crucial evidence of what had happened during those months in 1944, when the extermination system reached its most intense phase. The burning pits, therefore, became more than just a logistical response to overcrowded crematoria. They represented a moment when the scale of the genocide became visible even within the tightly controlled environment of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The smoke rising above the camp carried silent testimony to what was happening there. For prisoners inside the camp, it served as a constant reminder of the fate awaiting those who arrived on the deportation trains. And for the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work beside the flames, the pits became one of the most haunting symbols of the unimaginable crimes committed within the boundaries of Birkenau. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The Engineering of Destruction. By the time Auschwitz-Birkenau reached its most intense phase of operation in 1944, the camp had evolved into a vast and carefully organized system designed to carry out extermination on an unprecedented scale. What made Birkenau particularly significant in the history of the Holocaust was not only the brutality of the crimes committed there, but also the systematic way in which the entire camp had been constructed to support those crimes. From the railway lines that brought deportation trains directly into the camp, to the layout of the crematoria and the forced labor units assigned to operate them, every element of Birkenau's design reflected a deliberate attempt to transform mass murder into a controlled and continuous process. The crematoria complexes stood at the center of this system. Built between 1943 and 1944, these large facilities combined gas chambers and cremation ovens within the same structures, allowing the SS to carry out killing and body disposal in one location. Each building had been carefully planned to manage the movement of victims through several stages. First came the arrival and disrobing rooms, where victims were told to remove their clothing under the pretense that they were about to undergo showers or disinfection. This deception was an important part of the process. By maintaining the illusion that the deportees were entering a routine facility rather than a killing chamber, the SS reduced the likelihood of panic or resistance. Once the victims had been forced to remove their belongings, they were directed into the gas chambers themselves. These chambers were often designed to resemble communal shower rooms, complete with fixtures that suggested water might flow from the ceiling. In reality, the chambers were sealed spaces where the poison gas Zyklon B was introduced through special openings. After the gas was released, the victims inside died within a short period of time, usually within minutes. The design of the crematoria then allowed the next stage of the process to begin quickly. Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to enter the chambers after the gas had dissipated and begin removing the bodies. These bodies were transported to the cremation ovens located in the same building. Each crematorium contained multiple furnace units designed to operate simultaneously. The ovens burned continuously when the camp was operating at full capacity. Engineers and camp administrators had calculated the theoretical number of bodies that could be burned in a day under such conditions. Yet these calculations were based on assumptions about how many victims would arrive and how quickly the cremation process could proceed. The SS believed that the crematoria would allow them to eliminate evidence of the killings almost as quickly as they occurred. However, the events of 1944 demonstrated that even this carefully designed system had limits. When deportations reached unprecedented levels, especially during the arrival of Hungarian Jews, the crematoria began to struggle under the enormous workload imposed upon them. The limitations of the crematoria became increasingly visible during the months when the deportation trains arrived almost without pause. Each transport brought hundreds or thousands of victims to Birkenau, and the selections carried out on the arrival ramp often sent the majority of them directly to the gas chambers. As the pace of extermination increased, the cremation ovens were pushed into continuous operation. Sonderkommando prisoners worked in shifts to maintain the process, feeding the furnaces and clearing the cremation rooms so that new bodies could be burned. Even with multiple ovens operating simultaneously in several buildings, the number of victims soon began to exceed what the system could handle. Bodies accumulated faster than the furnaces could process them. This situation posed a logistical challenge for the SS administrators responsible for maintaining the camp's operations. Their objective remained the same: to ensure that the extermination process continued without interruption while preventing evidence of the killings from accumulating in ways that might reveal the full scale of the crimes. In response to this problem, the SS expanded the use of open-air burning pits near the crematoria grounds. These pits served as emergency extensions of the cremation system, allowing large numbers of bodies to be burned outdoors when the ovens were already operating at full capacity. The pits were dug into the earth by prisoners under guard, creating trenches capable of holding hundreds of bodies at once. Sonderkommando units were then forced to transport corpses from the gas chambers and crematoria to these pits. The process of burning bodies in the trenches required constant attention. Prisoners arranged the bodies in layers and maintained the fires so that the flames burned hot enough to reduce the remains as completely as possible. The scale of this operation revealed how overwhelmed the extermination system had become during the peak months of 1944. Fires burned continuously in the pits while the crematoria chimneys released thick smoke into the sky. The combination of ovens and open-air pits created an atmosphere that many prisoners later described as impossible to forget. Smoke drifted across Birkenau and into the surrounding countryside, making the activity near the crematoria visible even from distant parts of the camp. The burning pits therefore became a symbol of how the extermination machinery at Auschwitz-Birkenau had reached a level far beyond its original design. What had begun as a system built for industrialized killing had expanded into an even larger operation where additional methods were required simply to keep the process moving. Chapter 5, Segment 2. The work of the Sonderkommando. Within the machinery of extermination that operated at Auschwitz-Birkenau, few prisoner groups were forced into roles as grim and psychologically devastating as those assigned to the Sonderkommando units. These prisoners, selected primarily from newly arrived Jewish deportees, were compelled by the SS to perform the labor that kept the crematoria and burning pits functioning. Their tasks placed them at the center of the killing system, forcing them to witness and handle the immediate aftermath of mass murder. From the moment they were selected for this work, the members of the Sonderkommando understood that their position within the camp was both temporary and perilous. The SS considered them necessary workers, yet also viewed them as dangerous witnesses to the crimes unfolding inside the crematoria complexes. As a result, the SS periodically replaced entire Sonderkommando units, executing older groups and selecting new prisoners to take their place. This practice was intended to ensure that few survivors would remain who could later testify about the details of the extermination process. The work assigned to these units began almost immediately after the gas chambers had been used. Once the gas had dissipated, the doors were opened and the Sonderkommando prisoners were ordered to enter. Inside the chambers, they were confronted with the bodies of the victims who had just been killed. Their orders were to remove the bodies quickly and prepare them for cremation. This process required moving hundreds of bodies from the gas chambers to the cremation ovens or, during the peak deportation period of 1944, to the burning pits outside. The work was carried out under the constant supervision of SS guards, who enforced strict discipline and demanded that the process continue without delay. The prisoners assigned to this labor had little opportunity to pause or reflect on what they were witnessing. Their survival depended on completing the tasks assigned to them, even though those tasks forced them to participate in the very system that had destroyed their families and communities. Many survivors later described how the SS deliberately attempted to isolate the Sonderkommando from the rest of the prisoner population. They were housed separately and rarely allowed to interact with inmates from other parts of the camp. This isolation served two purposes. It prevented the wider prisoner population from learning the full details of the extermination process, and it also ensured that the Sonderkommando units remained under close supervision. Yet despite this isolation, rumors and fragments of information spread throughout Birkenau. Prisoners working in other areas of the camp could see the smoke rising from the crematoria and the burning pits. Some heard whispers about the work being performed by the Sonderkommando, and these whispers slowly formed a picture of the grim reality inside the crematoria complexes. While the physical labor required of the Sonderkommando was extremely demanding, the psychological burden of their work was equally profound. Each day they were forced to handle the bodies of people who had arrived at the camp only hours earlier. Many of these victims were families who had been separated on the arrival ramp and sent directly to the gas chambers. The Sonderkommando prisoners were aware that they themselves had narrowly escaped the same fate, at least temporarily. This knowledge created a constant awareness that their own survival depended entirely on the needs of the SS and the operation of the crematoria. When deportations slowed or when the SS believed that a Sonderkommando unit had worked long enough to become a liability, the prisoners assigned to those units were often killed and replaced. Despite these conditions, members of the Sonderkommando attempted in small ways to preserve evidence of what they had witnessed. Some secretly wrote descriptions of the crematoria and the burning pits, recording details about the process of extermination and the scale of the killings. These writings were hidden in containers and buried near the crematoria grounds with the hope that someone might one day discover them. In later years, several of these documents were indeed recovered, providing historians with first-hand accounts of how the extermination system functioned during the final stages of the war. The existence of these hidden testimonies demonstrates that even within the most controlled environment of the camp, prisoners found ways to resist the complete erasure of the truth. At the same time, the Sonderkommando units occasionally attempted more direct forms of resistance. In October 1944, members of these units carried out one of the most dramatic acts of defiance within Auschwitz-Birkenau. Using explosives secretly obtained from prisoners working in nearby factories, they launched an uprising against the SS guards supervising the crematoria. During this revolt, one of the crematoria buildings was damaged and several guards were killed. Although the uprising was ultimately suppressed and many of the prisoners involved were executed, the event demonstrated that even within the most brutal circumstances, resistance remained possible. The story of the Sonderkommando therefore stands as one of the most complex and tragic aspects of Auschwitz-Birkenau's history. These prisoners were forced to operate the machinery of extermination, yet many of them also sought ways to preserve the truth about what was happening inside the crematoria. Their hidden writings and acts of resistance became part of the historical record, ensuring that the crimes carried out at Birkenau would not remain concealed. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Witnesses inside the system. Among the many prisoners forced to live within Auschwitz-Birkenau, the members of the Sonderkommando occupied one of the most isolated and tragic positions within the camp system. Their forced labor placed them directly inside the crematoria complexes and near the burning pits where the SS attempted to destroy the evidence of mass murder. Because of this role, these prisoners witnessed scenes that few others inside the camp were able to see. The SS authorities understood the danger posed by such witnesses. If the full details of the extermination process became widely known, the secrecy surrounding the operation would collapse. As a result, the Sonderkommando units were carefully controlled and separated from other prisoners whenever possible. They were housed in special barracks located near the crematoria grounds, and guards restricted their movement throughout the camp. This isolation served several purposes. It prevented communication between the Sonderkommando and the wider prisoner population, and it also allowed the SS to monitor them more closely. Yet even under these conditions, the prisoners assigned to these units began to understand that they carried a responsibility far beyond survival. They knew that what they had seen inside the crematoria represented one of the most horrific crimes in human history. If no record of their experiences survived, the SS might succeed in erasing the evidence of what had happened there. For this reason, several members of the Sonderkommando attempted to document their experiences secretly. Using scraps of paper obtained from various sources within the camp, they wrote detailed descriptions of the crematoria buildings, the gas chambers, and the burning pits operating nearby. These accounts often included observations about the arrival of deportation trains, the selections carried out on the ramp, and the constant movement of bodies through the cremation system. Because writing such testimonies was extremely dangerous, the prisoners took elaborate steps to hide the documents. Some were sealed inside containers or bottles and buried in the ground near the crematoria complexes. The hope was that if the writers themselves did not survive, someone in the future might discover these buried testimonies and learn the truth about the events that had taken place at Birkenau. These hidden writings eventually became some of the most important historical evidence from within the extermination process itself. Decades later, several of these documents were recovered from the crematoria grounds, providing historians with rare first-hand descriptions of the machinery of death that operated inside Auschwitz-Birkenau. The existence of these buried testimonies demonstrates how prisoners within the Sonderkommando struggled to preserve truth in an environment designed to destroy it. Every aspect of the extermination process was intended to eliminate both the victims and the evidence of their deaths. Bodies were burned in the crematoria ovens or in the open pits when the ovens could not keep pace with the scale of deportations. Personal belongings were sorted and transported away from the camp. Even the prisoners forced to operate the crematoria were eventually replaced so that fewer witnesses remained. Yet, despite this system of concealment, the act of recording and hiding these documents represented a quiet but powerful form of resistance. The prisoners who wrote them understood that they might never live to see the end of the war. Nevertheless, they believed that leaving behind a written record could ensure that future generations would know what had happened there. In addition to these written testimonies, the presence of the burning pits themselves made it increasingly difficult for the SS to hide the scale of the extermination operation. The smoke rising from the pits often drifted across Birkenau and into the surrounding countryside. Prisoners living in distant barracks could see the flames at night or smell the smoke carried by the wind. Even those who did not fully understand the details of the cremation process began to realize that something immense and terrible was occurring near the crematoria grounds. For the Sonderkommando prisoners working closest to the pits, this awareness carried a heavy emotional burden. They lived with the constant knowledge that their labor was part of the system destroying their own people. Yet within this grim reality, moments of solidarity sometimes emerged. Members of the Sonderkommando shared food when they could, exchanged quiet conversations about their families and the lives they had lost, and tried to support one another through the daily horrors they witnessed. These acts of solidarity did not change the system surrounding them, but they helped preserve a sense of human connection within an environment built to strip prisoners of dignity and identity. Over time, these small gestures of mutual support became another form of resistance against the dehumanizing machinery of the camp. The story of the Sonderkommando therefore stands not only as evidence of the crimes committed at Auschwitz-Birkenau, but also as a reminder of the resilience of those who endured them. Their writings, their quiet acts of solidarity, and their determination to record the truth ensured that the history of Birkenau's crematoria and burning pits would not disappear into silence. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Smoke that could not be hidden. By the middle of 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau had reached the most intense phase of its operation, a period when the machinery of extermination was working at a pace never before seen within the camp system. Deportation trains arrived one after another, carrying thousands of people who had been transported from across Nazi-occupied Europe. Among the largest of these deportations were the transports from Hungary, which began arriving in May 1944. Within a matter of weeks, hundreds of thousands of people were brought to Birkenau. The arrival ramp became a place of constant movement and noise as train cars opened and prisoners were forced out onto the platform under the watch of SS guards. The process that followed was swift and systematic. Families were separated during selections carried out almost immediately after arrival, and those judged unfit for forced labor were directed toward the crematoria complexes located deeper inside the camp. Because of the enormous number of people arriving each day, the crematoria were soon operating at their maximum capacity. Their furnaces burned continuously, and the Sonderkommando units assigned to the cremation process worked in exhausting shifts to keep the system functioning. Yet, even with multiple crematoria running simultaneously, the number of bodies produced by the extermination process soon exceeded what the ovens alone could handle. The SS administrators overseeing the camp were determined that the killing operation should not slow down. To solve the problem, they expanded the use of open-air burning pits near the crematoria grounds. These pits had been used before on smaller occasions, but in 1944 they became an essential part of the extermination system. Large trenches were dug into the earth by prisoners under guard, creating long pits where bodies could be burned in the open air. Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to transport corpses from the gas chambers to these pits and arrange them in layers so that the fires could burn effectively. Once the fires were lit, they were maintained continuously to ensure that the bodies were destroyed as completely as possible. From a distance, these burning pits produced a constant column of smoke that rose above the crematoria buildings. During the day, the smoke drifted across the camp and sometimes spread into the surrounding countryside. At night, the flames could sometimes be seen from other parts of Birkenau, flickering against the dark sky. These visible signs of the extermination process made it increasingly difficult for the SS to conceal what was happening inside the camp. Prisoners living in distant barracks could observe the smoke and understand that the crematoria were working beyond their normal limits. Even those who had not witnessed the gas chambers directly began to realize that Birkenau had become the center of a vast operation of destruction. The smoke rising from the burning pits was more than just a physical consequence of the cremation process. For many prisoners inside Birkenau, it became a symbol of the camp's true purpose. Every day the smoke appeared again above the crematoria area, carried by the wind across the fields and barracks that made up the camp complex. Prisoners who had arrived weeks or months earlier often watched the sky with a sense of dread, knowing that the fires represented the fate of those who had been sent to the gas chambers only hours before. Survivors later described how the smell from the crematoria grounds sometimes spread throughout Birkenau, especially on warm days when the wind carried it across the camp. Although the SS attempted to prevent prisoners from discussing what they saw or smelled, it became impossible to completely hide the scale of what was taking place. In many barracks, inmates whispered among themselves about the meaning of the smoke and the constant arrival of deportation trains. For newly arrived prisoners who had been selected for forced labor, these signs gradually revealed the reality of the camp. At first, some believed that the crematoria were simply facilities for disposing of those who had died from disease or exhaustion. But as the smoke continued to rise day after day, and as transports arrived in numbers far greater than the visible prisoner population, the truth slowly became clear. Birkenau was not only a labor camp, it was the central site of a system designed for mass killing. Beyond the camp fences, the smoke from the pits also attracted attention in nearby areas. Local residents living in villages around Auschwitz occasionally reported seeing unusual smoke columns rising from the direction of Birkenau. Although the SS guarded the camp heavily and restricted access to the crematoria zone, the scale of the burning operations meant that complete secrecy was impossible. Even so, the Nazi authorities attempted to maintain the appearance that the camp was simply a detention facility for prisoners. Guards enforced strict rules preventing inmates from approaching the crematoria area, and anyone suspected of discussing what was happening there risked severe punishment. Yet, the visual presence of the smoke itself made it difficult to fully suppress the truth. For the prisoners working within the Sonderkommando units, the smoke represented the final stage of the system they were forced to operate. Each day they labored beside the crematoria ovens and the burning pits, carrying out the grim work that ensured the SS could continue its extermination program without interruption. They watched the flames rise from the pits and understood that the fires were meant not only to destroy bodies, but also to erase the evidence of what had occurred inside the gas chambers. Despite this intention, the smoke itself became a silent witness to the crimes being committed. It drifted above Birkenau as a visible reminder that the machinery of extermination had reached a scale that even its designers struggled to conceal. Chapter 6, Segment 2. The arrival of the Hungarian transports. In the spring of 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau entered the most intense phase of its history, a period when the extermination system reached a scale that even the SS administrators had not originally anticipated. This dramatic escalation was largely driven by the deportation of Hungarian Jews, one of the final major Jewish communities still remaining in Europe under Nazi control. Until that time, Hungary had avoided large-scale deportations, but the situation changed rapidly in March 1944 when German forces occupied the country. Within weeks, Nazi authorities began organizing a massive deportation campaign aimed at transporting Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The speed with which this operation unfolded was extraordinary. By May of that year, trains were leaving Hungary almost every day, carrying thousands of men, women, and children toward the camp in occupied Poland. Each train consisted of tightly packed freight cars in which deportees had been confined for long and exhausting journeys. Many had little food or water during the trip, and the conditions inside the rail cars were extremely crowded. When these transports finally arrived at Birkenau, the deportees often emerged weak and disoriented after days of travel. The trains entered the camp through the railway extension that had been built directly into Birkenau. This line allowed the SS to bring transport straight to the arrival ramp located inside the camp itself. As the train doors opened, SS guards and camp personnel quickly forced the deportees onto the platform. The arrival process was highly organized and designed to move large numbers of people through the ramp as quickly as possible. Prisoners already living in the camp were sometimes assigned to unload luggage from the train cars while new arrivals were assembled into lines for inspection. Doctors and SS officers then carried out selections, dividing the deportees into groups within minutes of their arrival. Those considered capable of forced labor were sent to prisoner barracks and registered within the camp system. But the majority, often including the elderly, the sick, and most children, were directed toward the crematoria complexes. Because the Hungarian deportations brought such enormous numbers of people to Birkenau in a short period of time, the camp's extermination system was pushed to its limits. Trains arrived so frequently that selections sometimes occurred almost continuously throughout the day. The crematoria ovens were already operating at full capacity, and the Sonderkommando unit struggled to keep up with the constant flow of bodies from the gas chambers. It was during this period that the SS increasingly relied on the open-air burning pits near the crematoria buildings. These pits allowed the extermination process to continue even when the cremation ovens could no longer keep pace with the number of victims being sent to the gas chambers. For prisoners already living inside Birkenau, the arrival of the Hungarian transports was immediately noticeable. The rhythm of the camp changed as trains began arriving in unprecedented numbers. The arrival ramp became a place of constant activity where prisoners could hear the sounds of train whistles, shouting guards, and the movement of thousands of people stepping down from the freight cars. Even those inmates who worked in distant sections of the camp became aware that something extraordinary was happening. Columns of newly arrived prisoners could sometimes be seen being marched away from the ramp, while others disappeared toward the crematoria area located near the edge of Birkenau. The sheer number of deportees created scenes that survivors later described as overwhelming. Many of the Hungarian Jews arriving at Birkenau still believed they had been sent to a labor camp rather than a place of extermination. Families often stepped off the trains carrying suitcases or small bundles of personal belongings, expecting that they would soon be assigned housing or work within the camp. SS guards reinforced this deception by issuing calm instructions during the selection process, encouraging deportees to remain orderly and assuring them that they would be reunited later. In reality, The selections carried out on the ramp determined the fate of nearly everyone who arrived. The majority of deportees were sent directly toward the gas chambers located in the crematoria complexes. For the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work there, the months of the Hungarian deportations became one of the most demanding and devastating periods of their existence. The pace of work intensified dramatically as the gas chambers were used repeatedly throughout the day. Bodies were transported continuously from the chambers to the cremation ovens and, when the ovens could no longer handle the volume, to the burning pits outside. Fires burned day and night in the trenches as prisoners worked under the watch of SS guards to maintain the flames. Smoke from these fires rose above the camp in thick columns that could be seen from distant parts of Birkenau. Prisoners living in the barracks often noticed how the sky above the crematoria remained darkened by smoke, especially during the weeks when deportations from Hungary were arriving in the greatest numbers. This smoke became one of the most visible signs that the extermination process had reached an unprecedented scale. The burning pits and crematoria chimneys operated together in an attempt to keep pace with the endless flow of transports. Although the SS intended the cremation process to erase evidence of the killings, the constant smoke drifting above Birkenau revealed that the system had expanded beyond the capacity of its original design. For many prisoners inside the camp, the sight of that smoke marked the moment when the true scale of what was happening at Auschwitz-Birkenau became impossible to ignore. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Camp Overwhelmed. As the deportations from Hungary continued throughout the late spring and summer of 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau entered a phase that even its administrators struggled to manage. The extermination system had been designed with efficiency in mind, but the scale of the Hungarian transports quickly pushed that system to its limits. Trains arrived with relentless frequency, often carrying thousands of people at a time. The arrival ramp became one of the busiest places in the entire camp complex, a location where the machinery of selection operated almost without pause. SS officers stood on the platform directing the deportees into separate groups, while guards shouted orders and prisoners assigned to unloading duties moved luggage away from the trains. The entire procedure was designed to move rapidly, reducing the time between arrival and selection so that the camp could process each transport before the next one arrived. For those selected for forced labor, the experience of stepping onto the ramp was only the beginning of their struggle for survival within the camp. They were registered, assigned prisoner numbers, and sent to overcrowded barracks where thousands of inmates already lived under harsh conditions. But for the majority of deportees, the arrival ramp represented the final moment of their journey. Within minutes of stepping off the trains, they were directed toward the crematoria complexes located deeper inside Birkenau. Because the deportations were arriving in such enormous numbers, the extermination system began operating continuously. Gas chambers were used repeatedly throughout the day, and the Sonderkommando units were forced to work without interruption to clear the chambers and transport bodies to the cremation ovens. Even with multiple crematoria functioning at full capacity, the system soon became overwhelmed. The ovens had been built with the expectation that they could burn large numbers of bodies, but the pace of deportations meant that thousands were being killed faster than the crematoria could process them. This imbalance created a logistical crisis for the SS administrators responsible for maintaining the extermination operation. Their objective remained clear. The killing process was not to slow down under any circumstances. To maintain the pace of extermination, they turned increasingly to the open-air burning pits located near the crematoria grounds. These pits had already been used in previous periods when the ovens could not keep pace, but during the Hungarian deportations they became essential. Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to transport bodies from the gas chambers to the trenches, where they arranged them carefully so that the fires could burn efficiently. Large quantities of fuel were used to ignite the pits, and once the fires were burning they were maintained continuously to ensure that the bodies were destroyed as completely as possible. The combination of crematoria ovens and open-air pits created a scene that survivors later described as overwhelming. Smoke rose constantly from the crematoria chimneys and from the burning trenches, drifting across Birkenau and sometimes spreading into the surrounding countryside. For prisoners living elsewhere in Birkenau, the effects of this intensified extermination process became increasingly difficult to ignore. The camp had always been a place of suffering, but the months of the Hungarian deportations created an atmosphere that many survivors later described as uniquely disturbing. Smoke from the crematoria and burning pits often hung over the camp, especially during calm weather when the wind did not disperse it quickly. Prisoners working in distant sections of Birkenau could sometimes see the smoke columns rising above the crematoria area, while others noticed the smell that spread through the camp during certain days. Even those who had not yet understood the full details of the extermination process began to suspect that something enormous was taking place behind the guarded boundaries of the crematoria grounds. The constant arrival of trains added to this awareness. Each time a transport entered the camp, prisoners could hear the sound of rail cars grinding along the tracks and guards shouting orders on the ramp. Columns of newly arrived deportees sometimes passed through sections of the camp before reaching the crematoria area, providing brief glimpses of the families who had just arrived. Within hours, however, many of these people would vanish from sight, leaving only the smoke above the crematoria as evidence of what had happened. For the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work within the crematoria complexes, the months of 1944 represented one of the most exhausting and devastating periods of their lives. Their labor was constant, and the pace of work rarely slowed. Bodies were carried from the gas chambers to the ovens, while others were transported to the burning pits when the ovens could no longer keep pace. Guards supervised every step of the process, ensuring that the extermination system continued operating without interruption. Yet despite the SS efforts to maintain secrecy, the scale of the operation made concealment increasingly difficult. The smoke rising above Birkenau became a silent witness to the events unfolding inside the camp. It drifted across the fields surrounding Auschwitz and could sometimes be seen from nearby villages. Although the SS guarded the camp carefully and restricted access to the crematoria zone, the visible signs of the burning pits revealed that the extermination system had expanded beyond the limits of its original design. The months of the Hungarian deportations therefore marked a moment when the machinery of destruction at Auschwitz-Birkenau reached its most intense level. Trains arrived in endless succession, selections occurred with mechanical efficiency, and the crematoria and burning pits worked together in a grim attempt to keep pace with the flood of victims. For prisoners inside the camp, the smoke rising above Birkenau became an enduring symbol of that period, a reminder that the extermination system had grown so vast that even its architects struggled to hide its presence. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The World Beyond the Barbed Wire. While Auschwitz-Birkenau operated as a tightly controlled world surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and electrified fences, it did not exist entirely in isolation from the surrounding region. The camp was located near the town of Auschwitz in occupied Poland, an area where local villages, farmland, and railway lines continued to function throughout the war. Although the SS attempted to conceal the true purpose of Birkenau, the scale of activity inside the camp made complete secrecy impossible. Trains arrived regularly along the railway lines that connected Auschwitz to the wider European transport network. Freight cars carrying deportees passed through stations and countryside before reaching the gates of the camp. Local residents occasionally saw these trains moving through the region, sometimes noticing the crowded conditions inside the rail cars or hearing the voices of those being transported. Yet few could fully understand the fate awaiting those passengers once the trains reached their destination. The SS administration relied heavily on strict control of information to prevent the full truth from spreading beyond the camp. Guards were instructed not to discuss the operations of Birkenau with outsiders, and the camp itself was heavily guarded to prevent unauthorized access. The crematoria complexes were located toward the far edges of Birkenau, partly hidden behind trees and fences, and the burning pits were dug within restricted zones where prisoners were not allowed to approach unless they were assigned to the Sonderkommando units. Despite these precautions, signs of the camp's true function sometimes reached the outside world. One of the most visible signs was the smoke that rose from the crematoria chimneys and the open-air burning pits during periods of intense extermination. Columns of smoke could occasionally be seen from distant locations outside the camp perimeter, especially on clear days when the wind carried the smoke high into the sky. Local residents living in nearby villages sometimes reported unusual smells or smoke drifting from the direction of Birkenau. While the SS insisted that the camp was simply a labor facility for prisoners, the persistent smoke raised questions that could not easily be ignored. At the same time, information about Auschwitz began to spread through underground resistance networks operating throughout occupied Europe. Members of these networks included Polish resistance fighters, railway workers, and individuals who had indirect contact with the camp. Some prisoners who managed to escape Auschwitz carried reports describing what they had witnessed inside the camp. These escapees often attempted to reach resistance groups that could transmit their information to the outside world. Although many escape attempts failed, those who succeeded sometimes provided crucial details about the extermination system operating at Birkenau. Their testimonies described the arrival ramp, the selections carried out by SS doctors, and the existence of gas chambers and crematoria used to kill large numbers of people. Such reports gradually reached Allied governments and Jewish organizations outside Europe, contributing to the growing awareness that Auschwitz was not simply a prison camp, but a central site of mass extermination. Even as information about Auschwitz slowly reached the outside world, the reality inside the camp continued largely unchanged. Deportation trains continued to arrive, selections were carried out on the ramp, and the crematoria and burning pits operated in an attempt to eliminate the evidence of mass murder. The SS authorities remained confident that the combination of secrecy, isolation, and intimidation would prevent the full truth from spreading widely enough to disrupt their operations. Within Birkenau itself, prisoners often wondered whether anyone beyond the camp's fences knew what was happening there. Many inmates hoped that the outside world might eventually learn about the extermination process and take action to stop it. Yet the conditions inside the camp made communication extremely difficult. Letters were strictly controlled, and most prisoners had no opportunity to send messages beyond the camp. Even when information did reach resistance networks, it often took months to travel across occupied Europe. During that time, the extermination system continued operating with devastating efficiency. Some of the most detailed reports about Auschwitz came from prisoners who escaped the camp and later described what they had seen. Among the most well-known were the accounts of escapees who reached Slovakia and provided testimony to resistance leaders there. These reports described the gas chambers, the crematoria, and the burning pits used when the ovens could not keep pace with the number of victims. The escapees explained how deportation trains arrived regularly at Birkenau and how selections determined the fate of those who stepped off the trains. Their testimonies were eventually compiled into documents that became known as the Auschwitz Protocols. These reports circulated among resistance organizations and were eventually transmitted to Allied governments. By the time these documents reached international audiences, the extermination process at Auschwitz had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Nevertheless, the reports played an important role in revealing the scale of the crimes taking place there. For prisoners still inside Birkenau, however, such developments remained largely invisible. Their daily lives were defined by the routines of the camp: roll calls, forced labor, overcrowded barracks, and the constant presence of guards and watchtowers. The smoke rising from the crematoria remained one of the few visible signs that connected their world with the larger reality beyond the fences. Each column of smoke drifting across the sky reminded them that the extermination system was still operating nearby. It also served as a reminder that the crimes committed within Birkenau could not remain hidden forever. Even if the SS succeeded in destroying many of the physical traces of the killings, the testimonies of survivors and escapees would eventually reveal what had happened there. The story of Auschwitz-Birkenau therefore extended beyond the camp itself, reaching into the wider world through the efforts of those who risked their lives to carry the truth beyond the barbed wire. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Rumors, Resistance, and the Spread of Truth. Inside Auschwitz-Birkenau, information rarely moved freely. The camp had been designed not only to imprison people but also to control what they knew and what they could communicate. The SS administration understood that secrecy was essential to the success of the extermination system. If the full reality of what was happening inside the camp became widely known, it could provoke resistance both among prisoners and outside the camp's walls. For that reason, guards enforced strict rules against communication between different prisoner groups, and those who attempted to spread information about the crematoria or gas chambers risked severe punishment. Despite these efforts, rumors began to circulate among prisoners almost from the moment the extermination facilities were built at Birkenau. Some inmates had seen deportation trains arrive and had watched large groups of people disappear toward the crematoria complexes. Others noticed that the number of prisoners inside the camp did not increase in proportion to the number of transports arriving. Over time, these observations formed a pattern that many prisoners began to understand. Birkenau was not only a labor camp. It was a place where enormous numbers of people were being killed. Prisoners working in various camp assignments sometimes gathered fragments of information from different sources. Those who worked near the arrival ramp might hear guards discussing transports or selections. Others working in warehouses that sorted confiscated belongings noticed the constant flow of clothing and personal items arriving from newly deported victims. Still others saw the smoke rising from the crematoria area and wondered what could be producing such constant flames. These scattered observations gradually combined into whispered conversations within the barracks at night. Prisoners spoke quietly about what they suspected was happening beyond the restricted areas of the camp. Although many were afraid to voice their thoughts openly, the rumors continued spreading through the prisoner population. For those who had been in the camp for a long time, these rumors often confirmed fears that had been growing for months or even years. Some prisoners attempted to share this information with newly arrived inmates in hopes that they might better understand the danger they faced. However, the SS tried to maintain a powerful illusion that the camp functioned primarily as a labor facility. Deportees arriving on the trains were often told that they were being sent to work assignments or relocation camps. Guards sometimes reinforced these claims during selections, encouraging families to remain calm and orderly as they were divided into different groups. Because of this deception, many new arrivals found it difficult to believe the rumors circulating among older prisoners. Yet as days passed and more transports arrived, the pattern became increasingly clear. People who disappeared toward the crematoria rarely returned, and the smoke rising above Birkenau remained a constant reminder that something terrible was taking place there. Beyond the fences of Auschwitz-Birkenau, resistance networks operating throughout occupied Europe were also beginning to gather information about the camp. Poland had a strong underground resistance movement that attempted to document German activities across the occupied territory. Members of this resistance occasionally obtained information from railway workers, local civilians, or prisoners who had managed to escape from the camp. Each piece of information was valuable because it helped build a clearer picture of what was happening inside Auschwitz. One of the most important sources of information came from prisoners who successfully escaped the camp and reached resistance groups outside. Although escape attempts were extremely dangerous, a few prisoners managed to slip past the guards and make their way through the surrounding countryside. Once they reached safe locations, They often shared detailed descriptions of the camp's layout and operations. These escapees explained how deportation trains arrived regularly at Birkenau and how selections were carried out on the arrival ramp. They described the existence of gas chambers and crematoria designed specifically for killing large numbers of people. They also spoke about the burning pits used when the crematoria ovens could not keep pace with the number of victims being killed. These accounts were eventually transmitted through underground channels to resistance organizations in other parts of Europe. From there, the information sometimes reached neutral countries or allied governments. One of the most significant documents created from these testimonies was a detailed report describing Auschwitz-Birkenau's extermination system. The report included descriptions of the gas chambers, crematoria buildings, and the process by which deportees were selected and sent to their deaths. It also explained the massive deportations occurring during 1944, particularly those involving Hungarian Jews. Although the report circulated among various governments and organizations, the challenge of verifying such shocking information made it difficult for many people to grasp the full reality of what it described. For prisoners still inside Birkenau, however, the truth required no verification. They could see the smoke rising from the crematoria each day, hear the trains arriving at the ramp, and witness the endless cycle of selections and disappearances that defined life within the camp. Even though the SS attempted to suppress information and isolate prisoners from one another, the truth about Auschwitz gradually spread both inside and outside the camp. Rumors whispered in dark barracks eventually became documented reports carried across borders. These fragments of testimony formed the foundation of the historical record that would later reveal the scale of the crimes committed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Chapter 7, Segment 3. The Courage to Escape. Within the immense and tightly guarded world of Auschwitz-Birkenau, escape was almost impossible. The camp had been constructed with layers of security designed specifically to prevent prisoners from fleeing. High barbed wire fences surrounded the camp, many of them electrified with lethal current. Guard towers stood at regular intervals along the perimeter, each equipped with armed SS sentries who watched the grounds day and night. Floodlights illuminated the fences after dark, turning the camp into a bright and exposed landscape where movement could easily be seen from a distance. Beyond the fences stretched open fields and surrounding villages where German patrols could quickly intercept anyone attempting to escape. For these reasons, most prisoners understood that escape was extraordinarily dangerous. Yet despite the risks, some inmates continued to consider the possibility. The motivation behind these attempts varied. For some prisoners, escape represented a chance to survive and perhaps reach the outside world. For others, it was driven by a sense of responsibility to warn the world about what was happening inside Auschwitz. They believed that if they could reach resistance networks beyond the camp, they might be able to reveal the truth about the extermination process. Planning such an escape required patience, secrecy, and often the cooperation of several prisoners working together. Many attempts began quietly within barracks where inmates whispered about possible routes or strategies while avoiding the attention of guards. Prisoners who worked in certain labor details sometimes had slightly greater freedom of movement within the camp, and these assignments occasionally provided opportunities to gather information about guard routines or weak points in the perimeter defenses. Others attempted to obtain civilian clothing or food supplies that might help them survive after leaving the camp. Even with careful preparation, the chances of success remained extremely small. Guards conducted regular roll calls, and if a prisoner was discovered missing, the entire camp could be placed under lockdown while search parties scoured the surrounding countryside. In many cases, escape attempts ended in tragedy. Prisoners caught attempting to flee were often executed as a warning to others, and severe punishments were sometimes imposed on fellow inmates from the same barracks. Yet, despite these dangers, the determination to escape did not disappear. The hope of reaching the outside world and exposing the truth about Auschwitz continued to motivate certain prisoners to attempt the impossible. Among the escape attempts that succeeded, some became crucial sources of information about the extermination system operating at Auschwitz-Birkenau. One of the most significant occurred in April 1944, when two prisoners managed to slip out of the camp and travel across occupied territory until they reached safety. These men carried with them detailed knowledge of Birkenau's layout and operations. During their time in the camp, they had observed the arrival of deportation trains, the selections carried out by SS doctors, and the existence of gas chambers and crematoria used for mass killing. Once they reached resistance contacts outside the camp, they provided extensive testimony describing what they had witnessed. Their report included descriptions of the crematoria buildings, the process by which victims were led to the gas chambers, and the role of the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to operate the cremation system. It also described the burning pits used when the crematoria ovens could not keep pace with the number of victims. This testimony was eventually compiled into a document that circulated through underground resistance networks. Copies were transmitted to neutral countries and eventually reached Allied governments and Jewish organizations abroad. The report provided one of the earliest detailed descriptions of Auschwitz as an extermination center. It also warned that large-scale deportations were continuing and that thousands of people were being killed there each day. For those still imprisoned inside Birkenau, however, the existence of such reports remained largely unknown. Prisoners continued living under the daily routines of the camp, enduring forced labor, overcrowded barracks, and the constant presence of guards and watchtowers. Yet the escape attempts themselves carried symbolic importance even for those who did not succeed. They represented acts of defiance against a system designed to strip prisoners of all hope and autonomy. Each attempt demonstrated that the SS had not completely succeeded in controlling the prisoners' will to resist. Even in a place as tightly controlled as Auschwitz-Birkenau, individuals continued to search for ways to challenge the system that held them captive. The stories of those who attempted escape became part of the camp's quiet history, whispered among prisoners as reminders that resistance remained possible. In the years after the war, the testimonies of those who escaped Auschwitz played a crucial role in revealing the truth about the camp's operations. Their reports, combined with the memories of survivors and the physical evidence left behind, helped build the historical record that would later expose the full scale of the crimes committed at Birkenau. Chapter 8, Segment 1. The machinery begins to falter. By the second half of 1944, the immense system of extermination that had been operating at Auschwitz-Birkenau for years was beginning to show signs of strain. The camp had been constructed to function with ruthless efficiency, but even such a carefully designed system had limits. During the spring and summer, the deportation of Hungarian Jews had pushed the camp to its most extreme level of activity. Trains had arrived in constant succession, selections had been carried out at a relentless pace, and the crematoria had burned continuously. The smoke rising from the crematoria chimneys and the open-air burning pits had become one of the defining images of Birkenau during that time. Yet, as the months passed, the broader war beyond the camp began to shift. By late 1944, the military situation facing Nazi Germany was deteriorating rapidly. Allied forces had landed in Western Europe, pushing steadily toward Germany's borders, while the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east through occupied Poland. These developments created growing anxiety within the Nazi leadership. Auschwitz-Birkenau, once considered a distant and secure location for the extermination program, now lay closer to the front lines of a war that Germany was steadily losing. For prisoners inside the camp, news of the changing war situation often arrived in fragments. Information sometimes spread through newly arrived prisoners who had heard rumors during transport, or through inmates assigned to work details where they occasionally overheard guards discussing military developments. Although the SS attempted to control the flow of information, it was impossible to completely isolate the camp from the outside world. Gradually, whispers began circulating among prisoners that the war might be turning against Germany. These rumors sparked cautious hope in some inmates, though many remained skeptical after years of suffering. Even as the war situation changed, the extermination system at Birkenau continued operating. Deportation transports still arrived from various parts of Europe, though the pace of arrivals began to slow compared to the peak months of the Hungarian deportations. The crematoria complexes remained central to the camp's operations, and the Sonderkommando prisoners continued their grim labor within the gas chambers, ovens, and burning pits. Yet subtle changes in the camp's atmosphere became noticeable. Guards seemed increasingly tense, and administrative routines sometimes shifted in response to the changing military situation. For the first time since the crematoria had begun operating, the future of the extermination system itself began to appear uncertain. One of the most dramatic events reflecting this shift occurred in October 1944, when members of the Sonderkommando carried out a rare and desperate act of resistance inside Auschwitz-Birkenau. These prisoners, who had been forced to work within the crematoria complexes, had long understood that their role placed them in extreme danger. The SS regularly replaced Sonderkommando units to eliminate witnesses who knew too much about the extermination process. As a result, many prisoners assigned to these units believed that their own deaths were only a matter of time. Facing this grim reality, some members of the Sonderkommando began secretly planning an uprising. The plan required extraordinary coordination among prisoners working in different parts of the camp. Women assigned to labor in a nearby munitions factory managed to smuggle small amounts of gunpowder out of the facility over a period of weeks. This gunpowder was passed secretly to members of the Sonderkommando working near the crematoria buildings. Although the quantities were small, the prisoners hoped they might be enough to damage parts of the extermination infrastructure. On October 7, 1944, the uprising began. Members of the Sonderkommando launched an attack against the SS guards supervising one of the crematoria complexes. Using the smuggled explosives, they managed to damage part of Crematorium IV, causing significant destruction to the building. In the chaos that followed, several guards were injured or killed as prisoners attempted to break through the camp's defenses. However, the revolt was quickly suppressed by armed SS reinforcements. Many of the prisoners involved were killed during the fighting, and others were captured and later executed. Despite its tragic outcome, the uprising represented one of the most significant acts of resistance within Auschwitz-Birkenau. For a brief moment, prisoners forced to operate the machinery of extermination had managed to strike directly at the system that enslaved them. The destruction of Crematorium IV also marked a turning point in the history of the camp. It demonstrated that even the most tightly controlled environment could not completely extinguish the human desire to resist oppression. In the months that followed, the overall operation of the extermination system began to change as the war drew closer to Auschwitz itself. The crematoria that had once symbolized the efficiency of the Nazi killing apparatus were now part of a system that was slowly beginning to unravel under the pressure of war and resistance. Chapter 8, Segment 2. The SS attempts to erase the evidence. As the war turned decisively against Nazi Germany in late 1944, the leaders of the SS began to confront a growing fear. For years, Auschwitz-Birkenau had operated as one of the central sites of the Nazi extermination program, a place where hundreds of thousands of people had been murdered in gas chambers and their bodies destroyed in crematoria ovens and burning pits. But now the front lines of the war were moving steadily closer to the region. The Soviet Red Army was advancing westward through occupied Poland, and German forces were retreating under increasing pressure. For the SS authorities who had overseen the extermination system, this new reality raised a terrifying possibility. The camp might soon fall into enemy hands, exposing the full scale of the crimes that had been committed there. This fear triggered a series of decisions aimed at concealing as much evidence as possible before the approaching armies arrived. The process of hiding the crimes of Auschwitz had already begun earlier in the war under a broader operation known as Action 1005. That operation involved the systematic destruction of mass graves and other physical traces of mass killings across occupied Eastern Europe. But at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the situation was particularly urgent because the extermination facilities themselves still stood on the landscape. The crematoria buildings, the gas chambers, and the remains of the burning pits were visible signs of the machinery of death that had operated there for years. If Allied forces captured the camp intact, these structures could provide undeniable proof of the genocide that had taken place. In response, the SS began planning how to dismantle or destroy parts of the camp before the arrival of Soviet troops. Some of the crematoria had already been damaged during the Sonderkommando uprising in October 1944. Crematorium IV, for example, had been heavily damaged and was no longer fully operational after the revolt. Instead of rebuilding it, the SS allowed the structure to remain partially destroyed, recognizing that the war situation might soon force them to abandon the camp entirely. Other crematoria continued operating for a time, but the pace of extermination had slowed as deportations from across Europe declined. Even so, the structures themselves remained powerful evidence of what had occurred there. Meanwhile, inside the camp, prisoners noticed subtle changes in the behavior of the guards and administrators. The rigid routines that had governed daily life for years began to shift slightly as the SS prepared for the possibility of evacuation. Rumors spread among prisoners that the Germans might soon abandon Auschwitz or attempt to move inmates deeper into Germany. Some prisoners cautiously allowed themselves to hope that liberation might be approaching. Yet the uncertainty of the situation created its own kind of fear. No one knew how the SS might react if the front lines reached the camp. Past experience had shown that the guards were capable of extreme violence, and many prisoners worried that the SS might attempt to kill large numbers of inmates rather than allow them to be liberated. As the final months of 1944 approached, the SS began taking more direct steps to dismantle the physical structures associated with the extermination system. Their goal was to remove or destroy as much evidence as possible before the camp fell into Allied hands. One of the most significant targets of this effort was the crematoria complex itself. These buildings contained both gas chambers and cremation ovens, making them central to the extermination process that had defined Birkenau's role within the Holocaust. The SS understood that if these structures were discovered intact, they would reveal exactly how the killing system had functioned. Preparations were therefore made to destroy several of the crematoria buildings using explosives. At the same time, documents and administrative records related to the camp's operations were burned or removed. Prisoners assigned to certain work details later recalled seeing piles of paperwork being destroyed in an effort to eliminate written evidence of deportations, selections, and killings. The burning of these records represented another attempt by the SS to erase the traces of what had taken place at Auschwitz. Yet despite these efforts, many forms of evidence could not be fully destroyed. The camp itself was vast, and the number of prisoners who had witnessed aspects of its operation was enormous. Even if the SS succeeded in demolishing buildings and burning documents, the memories of survivors would remain. Within Birkenau, prisoners continued observing the changes around them. Some noticed that fewer deportation trains were arriving than before, while others heard whispers that the crematoria might soon be dismantled. The smoke that had once risen constantly above the crematoria chimneys appeared less frequently as the extermination system slowed. For many inmates, these changes created a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. On one hand, the slowing of deportations suggested that the machinery of mass murder was beginning to halt. On the other hand, the possibility of evacuation raised fears that prisoners might be forced into dangerous marches or transported to other camps further inside Germany. The SS had already begun evacuating camps located closer to the advancing Soviet forces, and similar plans were now being discussed for Auschwitz. In this tense atmosphere, prisoners waited anxiously to see what would happen next. The camp that had once seemed permanent, an enormous complex of barracks, fences, crematoria, and guard towers, was beginning to show signs of instability. For the SS administrators, the priority was now survival and concealment rather than expansion of the extermination program. For the prisoners, however, the approaching front lines offered the faint possibility that the nightmare of Auschwitz-Birkenau might soon come to an end. Chapter 8, Segment 3. The Final Winter at Birkenau. As the final months of 1944 faded into the cold winter of early 1945, Auschwitz-Birkenau entered one of the most uncertain periods in its existence. For years, the camp had functioned as a place where the routines of imprisonment and extermination operated with brutal regularity. Prisoners rose before dawn, endured roll calls in freezing weather, and were marched out to labor details under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Deportation trains had arrived in steady waves, bringing victims from across Europe. Smoke had risen constantly from the crematoria chimneys and the burning pits beyond them. Yet by the winter of 1945, the atmosphere inside the camp had begun to change in ways that many prisoners immediately sensed. The military situation surrounding Auschwitz was deteriorating rapidly for Nazi Germany. Soviet forces were advancing across Poland, pushing German troops steadily westward. Cities and towns that had once seemed far from the war were now being overtaken by the front lines. Although Auschwitz lay some distance behind German defensive positions, it was no longer considered secure. SS commanders began preparing for the possibility that the camp might soon be abandoned. Inside the camp, rumors spread quickly among prisoners as they observed subtle shifts in daily life. Guards appeared increasingly tense and hurried in their movements. Some administrative routines that had once been rigidly enforced now seemed less organized. Prisoners noticed that certain work details were being reassigned, while others were suddenly halted without explanation. The crematoria that had once operated continuously were no longer burning day and night as they had during the height of deportations. Smoke still appeared at times above the crematoria grounds, but it no longer filled the sky with the same relentless frequency as before. For prisoners who had spent months or years watching those chimneys, this change was impossible to ignore. At the same time, the SS continued their efforts to remove evidence of the extermination system before the advancing Soviet army could reach the camp. Some buildings connected to the killing process were dismantled or damaged, while documents related to the administration of the camp were destroyed. Prisoners working in certain areas reported seeing guards burning papers or loading crates of documents onto trucks bound for unknown destinations. The SS hoped that by eliminating records and destroying structures, they could obscure the scale of what had happened at Auschwitz. Yet the camp itself remained enormous, and many traces of its past operations could not be easily erased. The barracks, the guard towers, the electrified fences, and the vast railway ramp still stood as silent witnesses to the years of suffering that had unfolded there. As January 1945 approached, the SS began implementing a final plan to evacuate large numbers of prisoners from Auschwitz and its surrounding subcamps. The German leadership feared that if the Soviet army liberated the camp, thousands of surviving prisoners would become living witnesses to the crimes committed there. To prevent this, they decided to move many inmates westward toward camps deeper inside Germany. These evacuations would later become known as the death marches because of the brutal conditions under which prisoners were forced to travel. For the prisoners inside Auschwitz-Birkenau, the announcement of evacuation orders created a new wave of fear and uncertainty. Many inmates were already weak from months or years of starvation, disease, and forced labor. The prospect of marching long distances in the harsh winter weather seemed almost impossible to survive. Yet the SS guards enforced the evacuation orders with violence, forcing prisoners to assemble in columns and begin walking along icy roads away from the camp. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were often shot or left behind in the snow. Columns of prisoners stretched across the countryside as they were marched toward railway stations or other camps further west. Inside Auschwitz itself, not all prisoners were evacuated. Some inmates were left behind because they were too sick to move or because the evacuation was carried out hastily as Soviet forces approached. These prisoners remained in the camp's barracks during the final days before liberation, uncertain whether the guards might return or whether the camp would soon fall into the hands of advancing soldiers. Meanwhile, the SS attempted one final act of destruction aimed at concealing the extermination system. Several of the crematoria buildings at Birkenau were blown up with explosives shortly before the Germans retreated from the camp. The goal was to destroy the structures that had housed the gas chambers and cremation ovens, eliminating physical evidence of the machinery of mass murder. The explosions damaged parts of the crematoria complexes, leaving behind ruins that still stood amid the snow-covered landscape. Yet despite these efforts, the attempt to erase the past was incomplete. The scale of Auschwitz-Birkenau was too vast, and the memories of survivors too numerous, for the truth to be fully buried. In the final days before liberation, the camp fell into an eerie silence. The constant noise of arriving trains, shouting guards, and roaring crematoria fires had faded. The watchtowers still stood, but many of the guards had already departed with the evacuation columns. The winter wind moved through the empty sections of the camp, carrying with it the quiet aftermath of a place that had once been one of the most brutal centers of extermination in human history. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The Death March begins. In January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced steadily across Poland, the German SS leadership made a decision that would shape the final days of Auschwitz-Birkenau. They feared that if the camp were liberated intact, the surviving prisoners would become witnesses who could testify about the crimes committed there. Thousands of inmates had already seen the arrival of deportation trains, the selections on the ramp, and the smoke rising from the crematoria and burning pits. Allowing those witnesses to fall into Allied hands was unacceptable to the SS authorities. Instead, they decided to evacuate the majority of prisoners from the camp and force them westward into the interior of Germany. The evacuation was not planned with concern for the prisoners' survival. It was organized quickly and under harsh winter conditions. January in southern Poland brought freezing temperatures, heavy snow, and icy winds sweeping across the open countryside. Most prisoners were already weakened from starvation, disease, and years of forced labor. Many had little more than thin, striped uniforms and worn shoes to protect them from the cold. Despite this, they were ordered to assemble in large columns outside the barracks and prepare to march. The guards who supervised these evacuations were under strict instructions to keep the columns moving at all times. Prisoners who fell behind were threatened, beaten, or shot. The SS intended these forced marches to move tens of thousands of prisoners away from Auschwitz before the Soviet army could arrive. For many inmates, the sudden announcement of evacuation orders created a confusing mixture of hope and dread. On one hand, rumors had circulated for weeks that the front lines were approaching and that liberation might soon be possible. On the other hand, the prospect of being forced to march long distances in winter conditions was terrifying. Many prisoners could barely stand after years of hardship. Yet refusal was not an option. Guards moved through the camp shouting orders, forcing prisoners out of their barracks and into formation. The columns that formed inside Birkenau soon stretched far beyond the camp's gates. As the marches began, thousands of prisoners stepped onto the frozen roads leading westward, leaving behind the barbed wire fences and guard towers that had defined their world for so long. The marches quickly became one of the most brutal episodes in the final phase of the Holocaust. Prisoners were forced to walk for hours through deep snow and freezing winds, often without adequate food or rest. The SS guards demanded that the columns maintain a steady pace, regardless of the physical condition of the prisoners. Those who stumbled or collapsed were frequently shot on the roadside or left behind in the snow. Survivors later described the terrifying atmosphere of these marches. The sound of boots crunching through ice mixed with the barking of orders from guards and the distant gunshots that marked the fate of those who could no longer continue. Many prisoners attempted to support one another during the march, sharing what little strength they had. Some helped weaker companions remain on their feet, knowing that falling behind could mean death. Yet the exhaustion and cold made it increasingly difficult for prisoners to keep moving. Nights were especially harsh. In some cases, prisoners were forced to sleep outdoors in freezing temperatures, lying close together in an attempt to conserve warmth. In other cases, they were crowded into barns or temporary shelters along the route before being forced back onto the road at dawn. The marches sometimes continued for several days before prisoners reached railway stations where trains waited to transport them further west. These trains were often little better than the freight transports that had originally carried deportees to Auschwitz. Prisoners were packed tightly into open or partially covered rail cars, exposed to winter winds during the journey. Some died during these transports from cold or exhaustion. Others arrived at new camps deeper inside Germany where overcrowding and disease were already widespread. For the SS, the death marches served a clear purpose. By moving prisoners away from Auschwitz, they hoped to prevent large numbers of survivors from being liberated by the advancing Soviet army. They also hoped to continue using prisoners as forced labor in other parts of the collapsing Nazi war economy. For the prisoners themselves, however, the marches represented yet another stage of suffering layered on top of years of imprisonment. Many who had survived the camps for years now faced a deadly journey through the winter landscape. The roads leaving Auschwitz became lined with the bodies of those who could not continue, silent witnesses to the final cruelty inflicted by the SS as their control over the camp system began to crumble. Chapter 9, Segment 2. The Roads of Winter. As the evacuation of Auschwitz-Birkenau unfolded in January 1945, thousands of prisoners were forced onto roads that cut across the frozen countryside of southern Poland. These roads had once been ordinary rural paths connecting villages and railway stations, but during those weeks they became the routes of what would later be known as the death marches. Prisoners walked in long, uneven columns under the supervision of armed SS guards. The winter landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving. Snow covered the fields, and icy winds swept across the open terrain. Many prisoners had no proper winter clothing. Their thin uniforms, already worn from months or years of use, offered little protection against the cold. Shoes were often damaged or missing, leaving some inmates walking directly on frozen ground. Despite these conditions, the guards demanded constant movement. The columns had to keep walking, sometimes for hours without pause. The SS officers leading the marches were determined to move the prisoners away from the advancing Soviet forces. Each step carried the prisoners farther from Auschwitz, yet it did not bring them closer to safety. Instead, it pushed them deeper into a collapsing system of camps where disease, starvation, and overcrowding were already severe. As the march continued, exhaustion quickly spread through the columns. Prisoners who had survived years inside the camps were already weakened by malnutrition and forced labor. Now they were expected to march through deep snow while carrying the few belongings they had been allowed to take from the barracks. Many had no food during the journey. Occasionally guards distributed small rations of bread, but these were rarely enough to sustain the prisoners through long days of marching. The cold itself became one of the greatest enemies of those on the road. The winter wind cut through clothing and numbed hands and feet. Some prisoners developed frostbite as the march continued, making it even harder to keep walking. Yet stopping was rarely possible. Guards patrolled the sides of the columns with rifles, shouting orders and threatening those who slowed down. The sound of gunfire sometimes echoed along the road when prisoners collapsed from exhaustion and could not rise again. For those still walking, each gunshot served as a reminder of the consequences of falling behind. In these conditions, prisoners often relied on one another for support. Friends or fellow inmates from the same barracks tried to remain together within the columns. Sometimes stronger prisoners helped weaker ones remain upright, sharing a small portion of food or encouraging them to take another step forward. These acts of solidarity were small but powerful gestures of humanity within an environment designed to crush hope. Even so, the march remained relentless. Day after day, the prisoners continued moving through villages and fields, leaving behind a trail of suffering that stretched across the winter landscape. The presence of these marching columns did not go unnoticed by the civilians living in the surrounding region. Villagers along the routes sometimes witnessed the strange and tragic scenes unfolding on the roads outside their homes. They saw long lines of prisoners walking slowly through the snow, guarded by armed SS soldiers. The prisoners' striped uniforms and gaunt faces revealed the extreme conditions they had endured. In some places, local residents quietly offered small acts of assistance despite the danger involved. A piece of bread tossed toward a prisoner or a cup of water handed to someone passing by could mean the difference between survival and collapse. Such acts were risky, as helping prisoners could bring severe punishment from the German authorities. Yet some civilians chose to take that risk, driven by compassion for the suffering they witnessed. For the prisoners themselves, the sight of villages and farms along the road sometimes brought mixed emotions. These landscapes represented a world beyond the fences of Auschwitz, a world many had not seen for years. Yet the guards and the harsh conditions of the march ensured that the prisoners remained trapped within the system even as they passed through ordinary communities. Nights along the march routes were often the most difficult moments. In some cases, prisoners were forced to sleep outdoors in fields or along the roadside, huddling together for warmth in the freezing darkness. On other nights, they were crowded into barns or abandoned buildings where they lay packed together on the floor. Rest was brief and uncomfortable. Guards often woke the prisoners before dawn, ordering them back onto the road for another day of marching. As the evacuation continued, the columns gradually reached railway stations where trains waited to transport the prisoners further west. These trains were frequently overcrowded freight cars similar to those used earlier in the war to transport deportees to the camps. Prisoners were pushed inside the rail cars with little space to move, sometimes standing for long hours during the journey. Cold air blew through gaps in the wooden walls, and food remained scarce. The journey that followed would carry many of them to other camps inside Germany where the final months of the war were unfolding under desperate conditions. The roads leading away from Auschwitz therefore became more than simple evacuation routes. They became paths of suffering that reflected the collapse of the Nazi camp system in its final days. The death marches carried prisoners across frozen landscapes while the war raged around them, leaving behind a trail of tragedy that would later become one of the most haunting chapters in the history of the Holocaust. Chapter 9, Segment 3. Those who were left behind. While tens of thousands of prisoners were forced onto the winter roads during the evacuation marches from Auschwitz, not everyone was taken from the camp. As the SS rushed to move large numbers of inmates westward ahead of the advancing Soviet army, many prisoners were simply left behind inside Auschwitz-Birkenau. Some were too sick or too weak to walk. Others were hidden in hospital barracks or remained in sections of the camp that the guards had not fully cleared before departing. The evacuation itself had been carried out quickly and chaotically, and in the confusion thousands of prisoners remained inside the camp complex when the marching columns disappeared down the frozen roads. For those who stayed behind, the atmosphere inside Auschwitz changed dramatically in the days that followed. The camp that had once been filled with constant noise and movement suddenly fell into an eerie quiet. The endless roll calls, the shouting guards, and the arrival of deportation trains had defined life there for years. Now many of those sounds had vanished. Entire sections of the camp stood nearly empty after the evacuation columns had departed. Barracks that once held hundreds of prisoners were suddenly silent except for the weak voices of the sick who had been unable to march. The guard towers still stood along the electrified fences, but in some areas the guards themselves had already withdrawn. Prisoners who remained in the camp moved cautiously through the empty spaces, unsure of what might happen next. Many feared that the SS might return and kill those who had been left behind rather than allow them to be liberated by the approaching Soviet forces. Others wondered whether the guards had abandoned the camp entirely. Food was extremely scarce during these final days. The camp kitchens had largely ceased functioning, and the remaining prisoners searched the barracks for scraps of bread or any supplies that might still be hidden in storage rooms. Some ventured into areas of the camp that had previously been restricted, discovering warehouses or work sites that had been abandoned during the evacuation. These places sometimes contained small quantities of food or clothing left behind in the hurried departure. Yet, for the most part, survival depended on sharing whatever little resources could be found. Prisoners who were able to walk helped those who were weaker, bringing water or small portions of food to those lying in the infirmary barracks. These acts of solidarity were vital in a camp where medical supplies had almost completely disappeared. The cold winter weather added another layer of hardship. January temperatures in the region often dropped far below freezing, and many barracks had little heating available. Prisoners wrapped themselves in whatever blankets or clothing they could find, trying to conserve warmth while they waited for whatever would happen next. During these final days before liberation, the sense of uncertainty inside Auschwitz was overwhelming. The prisoners who remained behind had little information about the advancing Soviet forces or the situation beyond the camp fences. Some believed liberation might be only days away, while others feared that the guards might return and resume control of the camp. In this tense atmosphere, small groups of prisoners began cautiously exploring areas of the camp that had previously been inaccessible. Some discovered storehouses filled with confiscated belongings taken from deported victims, piles of clothing, suitcases, and personal items that had once belonged to families who never returned from the crematoria. These warehouses were stark reminders of the vast number of people who had passed through Auschwitz during the years of its operation. Even in the quiet of the nearly abandoned camp, the evidence of what had happened there remained visible everywhere. The crematoria buildings at Birkenau still stood in damaged form after the explosions carried out by the SS before their retreat. Chimneys and ruins marked the places where the gas chambers and ovens had once operated continuously. The railway ramp where deportation trains had arrived remained silent, its tracks now covered with snow. For many prisoners who walked through these areas during the final days, the silence felt almost unreal compared to the constant activity that had filled the camp before the evacuation. Meanwhile, beyond the fences, the sound of distant artillery occasionally echoed across the landscape. The front lines of the war were moving closer with each passing day. Although the prisoners could not see the approaching soldiers, they sensed that the conflict was drawing near. Each distant explosion raised the possibility that liberation might finally arrive. On January 27, 1945, that moment came. Units of the Soviet Red Army reached the outskirts of Auschwitz and entered the camp complex. What they found was a place of silence and devastation. Thousands of prisoners remained inside the barracks, many of them severely ill, emaciated, and unable to stand. The soldiers quickly realized that they had discovered one of the largest camp complexes in the Nazi system. Medical teams began providing aid to the surviving prisoners while Soviet investigators started documenting what they saw within the camp. For the prisoners who had survived long enough to witness this moment, The arrival of the Soviet troops marked the end of years of imprisonment and suffering. Yet the camp itself remained filled with the traces of what had occurred there. The abandoned barracks, the ruins of the crematoria, and the piles of confiscated belongings all testified to the immense scale of the crimes committed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Liberation did not erase those memories, but it ensured that the truth about the camp would no longer remain hidden behind barbed wire and guard towers. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Discovery of Auschwitz. When Soviet soldiers entered the Auschwitz complex in January 1945, they encountered a place unlike anything most of them had ever seen. For years, the camp had been hidden behind layers of secrecy and guarded isolation. Although rumors of German concentration camps had circulated throughout Europe during the war, the full scale of what had happened at Auschwitz-Birkenau remained largely unknown. As the soldiers advanced through the gates and across the snowy grounds, they began to realize that they had discovered something far larger and more horrifying than a typical military prison or labor camp. The first impression many soldiers described later was the silence. The vast camp complex stretched across fields and forested areas, with rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers, fences, and railway tracks disappearing into the winter landscape. Yet much of the place felt strangely quiet. The SS guards who had once patrolled the camp had mostly fled during the evacuation days earlier. What remained were thousands of prisoners who had been too sick or weak to march west with the evacuation columns. Many of them lay in the barracks unable to stand, their bodies emaciated after years of starvation and forced labor. Soviet soldiers quickly began providing emergency assistance, distributing food and medical care to those who could still respond. For the prisoners who had survived long enough to witness this moment, the arrival of the soldiers marked the end of a nightmare that had seemed endless. Some inmates were too weak even to rise from their bunks, while others stepped cautiously into the open air to watch the unfamiliar uniforms moving through the camp. The soldiers themselves were stunned by the conditions they encountered. They saw overcrowded barracks filled with sick prisoners, medical wards without supplies, and warehouses packed with personal belongings confiscated from deported victims. In one area of the camp, they discovered enormous piles of clothing, coats, dresses, shoes, and children's garments that had once belonged to the people transported to Auschwitz. These belongings had been sorted and stored by prisoners working under SS supervision, intended for shipment back to Germany after their owners had been killed. Elsewhere, Soviet troops found warehouses containing suitcases marked with names and addresses, along with stacks of eyeglasses, prosthetic limbs, and other personal items taken from deportees upon arrival. Each discovery revealed another fragment of the immense system that had operated inside the camp. The railway ramp where deportation trains had once arrived stood silent beneath the winter sky. Nearby, the ruins of the crematoria buildings still marked the locations where gas chambers and ovens had been used to carry out mass murder. Although the SS had attempted to destroy parts of these structures before retreating, the remaining ruins provided clear evidence of the machinery that had once operated there. Soviet investigators began documenting everything they saw, realizing that the camp represented one of the most significant crime scenes of the war. As the days following liberation unfolded, the full scale of Auschwitz-Birkenau slowly began to emerge. The Soviet army had entered the camp expecting to find prisoners and military installations, but what they discovered instead was a vast network of buildings and infrastructure dedicated to imprisonment and extermination. Medical teams worked urgently to treat the thousands of surviving inmates who had been left behind during the evacuation. Many prisoners were suffering from severe malnutrition, illness, and exposure after months or years of deprivation. Doctors and nurses struggled to provide treatment with the limited supplies available in the immediate aftermath of liberation. Some prisoners were too weak to recover even after help arrived. Others gradually regained enough strength to speak about what they had witnessed during their time in the camp. Their testimonies began to reveal the true purpose of Auschwitz. Survivors described the arrival of deportation trains, the selections carried out on the ramp, and the gas chambers where victims were murdered. They spoke about the crematoria ovens and the burning pits that had operated when the ovens could not keep pace with the number of bodies. They described the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work inside the crematoria complexes and the attempts by the SS to destroy evidence before abandoning the camp. These testimonies, combined with the physical remains of the camp itself, provided investigators with powerful proof of the extermination system that had operated there. The Soviet authorities soon organized formal investigations to document the crimes committed at Auschwitz. Photographs were taken of the barracks, the crematoria ruins, and the warehouses filled with confiscated belongings. Survivors were interviewed about their experiences, and records discovered within the camp were collected as evidence. These investigations would later play an important role in revealing the truth about the Holocaust to the wider world. For many soldiers who had fought across Europe during the war, the discovery of Auschwitz became one of the most unforgettable moments of their service. They had witnessed the destruction of cities and the suffering caused by years of conflict, but nothing had prepared them for the systematic brutality they encountered inside the camp. The rows of barracks, the piles of clothing, and the remains of the crematoria all told a story of industrialized killing carried out over several years. For the survivors who remained inside Auschwitz after liberation, the camp would forever be associated with the years of suffering they had endured there. Yet the arrival of the Soviet army ensured that the story of Auschwitz would not remain hidden. The gates of the camp were no longer guarded by SS soldiers. Instead, the world would soon begin to learn what had happened behind those fences, and the ruins of Birkenau would stand as lasting evidence of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Chapter 10, Segment 2. The Evidence That Remained. After the liberation of Auschwitz in January 1945, the vast camp complex became one of the most important sites of investigation into the crimes committed during the Holocaust. Soviet authorities quickly realized that what they had discovered was not simply another prison camp abandoned by retreating German forces. The scale of the facilities, the number of prisoners left behind, and the enormous quantities of personal belongings stored in warehouses all pointed to something much larger. Within days of liberation, Soviet investigators began documenting the camp in detail. Their goal was to preserve evidence of what had happened there before time, weather, or human activity could alter the scene. The investigators moved through the camp photographing buildings, collecting documents, and interviewing surviving prisoners. They carefully examined the crematoria ruins at Birkenau, noting the remains of structures that had once contained gas chambers and cremation ovens. Although the SS had attempted to destroy several of the crematoria before retreating, large sections of the buildings still stood in damaged form. These ruins revealed the layout of the extermination facilities and confirmed the testimonies given by survivors about how the system had operated. The investigators also explored the warehouses located within the camp complex. Inside these buildings, they discovered enormous piles of items that had been confiscated from deported victims. The scale of these discoveries was staggering. Thousands upon thousands of shoes filled entire rooms, stacked in uneven heaps that seemed to stretch endlessly across the floors. There were mountains of clothing, coats, dresses, scarves, and children's garments that had once belonged to the people transported to Auschwitz. Suitcases marked with names and addresses were piled high, many still bearing labels that indicated the towns and cities from which their owners had come. In another warehouse, investigators found large collections of eyeglasses, toothbrushes, kitchen utensils, and other everyday objects. Each item had once been part of someone's life before that person had been deported to the camp. The SS had systematically collected these belongings after deportees were forced to leave them behind during the arrival process. Prisoners assigned to special work units had sorted and packed these items for shipment to Germany, where they were intended to be reused or redistributed. The presence of these vast collections of belongings revealed the enormous number of people who had passed through Auschwitz over the years. Even without knowing the precise numbers of victims, the physical evidence itself made clear that the camp had processed an immense population of deportees. For investigators and soldiers walking through those warehouses, the piles of objects carried a powerful emotional weight. Each shoe, suitcase, or coat represented a person whose story had been interrupted by the machinery of the camp. As more evidence was gathered, the story of Auschwitz-Birkenau gradually became clearer to the outside world. The testimonies of survivors played a crucial role in explaining how the camp had functioned. Prisoners described the arrival of deportation trains and the selections carried out on the ramp, where SS officers determined who would be sent to forced labor and who would be directed to the gas chambers. They explained how victims were told they were entering showers or disinfection facilities before being locked inside gas chambers where poison gas was released. Survivors who had worked near the crematoria described the ovens used to burn bodies and the burning pits that had been dug when the crematoria could not keep pace with the number of victims. These accounts were recorded by investigators and later used as evidence in trials against Nazi officials responsible for the camp system. In addition to survivor testimonies, investigators also examined documents and records that had not been destroyed during the SS retreat. Some administrative paperwork remained within the camp offices, including transport lists and registration records for prisoners selected for labor. Although the SS had burned many documents before abandoning Auschwitz, the surviving records helped historians and investigators reconstruct the administrative structure of the camp. Together with physical evidence and witness testimony, these records formed the basis for understanding how the extermination system had operated. News of the discoveries at Auschwitz spread gradually across the world during the final months of the war. Reports describing the camp's liberation and the evidence found there appeared in newspapers and official statements issued by Allied governments. Photographs taken during the investigation were published, showing the barracks, the warehouses of confiscated belongings, and the ruins of the crematoria. For many people reading these reports, the scale of the crimes revealed at Auschwitz was difficult to comprehend. The war had already exposed countless acts of violence and destruction, but the systematic nature of the extermination program carried out at Auschwitz represented something unprecedented. The camp became one of the most powerful symbols of the Holocaust and the wider system of Nazi persecution that had targeted millions of people across Europe. In the years that followed, Auschwitz would remain a central location for remembering and studying these events. The buildings, ruins, and artifacts left behind in the camp provided historians and visitors with direct evidence of the crimes committed there. Although the SS had attempted to destroy parts of the camp before retreating, enough remained to ensure that the truth about Auschwitz could never be fully erased. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Memory and the Legacy of Auschwitz. After the liberation of Auschwitz in January 1945, the camp did not simply disappear into history. Instead, it became one of the most powerful symbols of the Holocaust and the crimes committed during the Second World War. In the months and years that followed the end of the war, investigators, historians, and survivors began the difficult process of understanding what had happened there. The evidence discovered inside the camp, combined with the testimonies of those who survived, revealed the scale of the extermination system that had operated at Auschwitz-Birkenau. For many survivors, the period immediately after liberation was both a moment of relief and the beginning of a long and painful journey toward rebuilding their lives. Many had lost families, homes, and entire communities during the years of Nazi persecution. The camp where they had suffered now stood as a place filled with memories that were impossible to forget. Some survivors eventually returned to their former homes, while others began new lives in different countries across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Wherever they settled, the memory of Auschwitz remained a central part of their personal histories. Their testimonies became one of the most important ways the world learned about the reality of the camp system. Survivors spoke about the arrival ramp where deportation trains had stopped, the selections carried out by SS officers, and the crematoria where victims were murdered and burned. They described the daily life inside the barracks, the forced labor details, the roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing weather, and the constant fear that defined life inside the camp. These stories were shared in interviews, memoirs, and later in public testimony during war crimes trials. Each account added another layer to the historical understanding of Auschwitz. At the same time, the physical remains of the camp itself became an important place of remembrance. The ruins of the crematoria at Birkenau, the rows of wooden barracks, and the barbed wire fences all stood as silent witnesses to what had taken place there. In the years following the war, efforts were made to preserve these structures so that future generations could see the site where the crimes had occurred. The camp was eventually turned into a museum and memorial, where visitors from around the world could learn about the history of Auschwitz and the lives of the people who had been imprisoned there. Walking through the grounds of the camp, visitors could see the same railway tracks that had once carried deportation trains into Birkenau. They could stand inside barracks where prisoners had slept in overcrowded conditions, or view the warehouses where confiscated belongings had been stored. These places offered powerful reminders that the events of the Holocaust were not distant myths but real historical experiences that had unfolded within these buildings and fields. The legacy of Auschwitz extends far beyond the physical boundaries of the camp itself. Over the decades since the end of the war, the name Auschwitz has become a symbol of the Holocaust and of the dangers of hatred, racism, and totalitarian power. Historians have continued to study the camp and its role within the broader system of Nazi persecution. Research has examined how Auschwitz was built, how the extermination facilities were designed, and how the camp functioned as part of the Nazi regime's plan to destroy entire communities. This research has relied on a combination of sources: survivor testimonies, official documents recovered after the war, photographs taken during the liberation and investigation of the camp, and the physical evidence preserved at the site itself. Together, these sources provide a detailed picture of how the camp operated and how millions of people were affected by its existence. At the same time, Auschwitz has become a place where people gather to remember the victims of the Holocaust and reflect on the lessons of history. Memorial ceremonies are held each year to honor those who died there. Survivors who return to the camp often speak about their experiences, sharing memories that connect the present generation with the past. Their voices remind visitors that the events associated with Auschwitz were not abstract historical events but lived experiences endured by real people. The preservation of the camp also serves another important purpose: education. Students, researchers, and visitors who walk through the site encounter direct evidence of the structures used in the camp system. The railway ramp, the guard towers, the electrified fences, and the ruins of the crematoria all reveal how the camp had been organized. These physical traces help explain how a system of industrialized persecution and extermination could be constructed and operated over several years. Understanding this history is essential for preventing similar crimes in the future. The story of Auschwitz is therefore not only about the past but also about the responsibility carried by later generations. By remembering what happened there and studying the historical evidence, societies can confront the consequences of hatred and authoritarian power. The ruins of Auschwitz-Birkenau remain standing today as a warning and a memorial. They remind the world of the millions of lives lost and the countless families destroyed during the Holocaust. And they ensure that the history of the camp, once hidden behind barbed wire and guarded gates, will continue to be remembered and studied by future generations. As we come to the end of this story, we are left with the quiet ruins of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Rows of barracks, broken crematoria, and the silent railway tracks where countless trains once arrived. These places remind us not only of the suffering that happened here, but also of the importance of remembering it. History like this must never fade into silence, because understanding the past helps us protect the future. If you found this documentary meaningful and want to learn more about the hidden stories of World War II and the Holocaust, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these important histories alive and allows more people to learn about the events that shaped our world. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to remember.